Let's get directly into The Ghost of the ER. Part 1. The Ghost on the Stage. The highly powerful Millionaire CEO confidently entered the highly massive hall, completely with his highly glamorous elite fiancée. But his massive heart completely, violently, stopped exactly when he vividly saw his highly devoted ex-girlfriend, highly proudly receiving her highly prestigious diploma, fiercely holding by the tiny hand her highly innocent, adorable young son. Richard Sterling had highly successfully learned exactly how to peacefully live completely with highly terrifying ghosts. But he absolutely never, ever could have highly creatively imagined exactly that one highly beautiful day he would vividly see exactly one entirely of them confidently crossing the massive stage entirely at a highly prestigious graduation ceremony, fiercely holding the tiny hand entirely of his biological child. The highly massive auditorium entirely of highly prestigious Columbia University loudly hummed completely with highly impatient, vibrant energy, completely overflowing, completely with highly proud families, fiercely holding highly expensive flowers and advanced cameras. Richard peacefully sat entirely in the highly exclusive VIP zone, highly strictly reserved, absolutely only, entirely, for highly elite sponsors, in the absolute first front rows perfectly, right perfectly, next completely to his highly powerful business partner, Victor Pierce. They had highly generously donated so incredibly, highly, much massive money completely to the highly elite university. Exactly that the highly massive brand new engineering building exactly now highly proudly bore their highly famous name. Their highly expensive portraits proudly hung entirely in the highly exclusive administrative corridor. Exactly. This was exactly what highly massive success visually looked exactly like exactly now. Highly expensive, bespoke tailored suits, highly exclusive reserved seats, highly famous names, highly permanently carved, completely in solid stone. Absolutely all. Exactly. This highly pathetic pompousness, entirely of massive achievements, had absolutely been highly expensively bought completely with massive money. Exactly that. Entirely and highly absolute fact, explicitly meant, completely, utterly nothing. You visually seem incredibly distracted. Victor incredibly quietly noticed entirely, while the highly respected dean highly eloquently delivered the highly anticipated opening speech. Richard highly tightly clenched his sharp jaws, highly simply, incredibly tired. Highly toxic lies had miraculously become officially a highly familiar, comfortable routine, entirely for them. He had highly maliciously lied completely to completely himself, entirely for agonizing years. Smoothly moving completely through the agonizing days, exactly like a highly pathetic sleepwalker. Highly miraculously, building a highly massive empire, completely upon a highly fragile foundation, entirely of his absolute own highly pathetic cowardice. Highly exhausting work completely, violently, devoured his highly precious time. Highly massive mergers and acquisitions, highly seamlessly filled. Exactly those highly dark voids, exactly where highly true, beautiful life absolutely should have perfectly been. He was highly successfully completely by absolutely all highly conceivable parameters. Absolutely. Except exactly those highly specific ones. Exactly that highly, truly, genuinely mattered. But exactly today, absolutely everything was completely different. Exactly today. He had highly bravely made a highly massive decision. Exactly that. Completely, violently terrified him significantly bigger than absolutely any highly complex business negotiations. Exactly 3 agonizing weeks completely ago. In absolutely another highly exhausting sleepless night, entirely in his highly massive luxury penthouse, entirely in massive Manhattan. Richard smoothly opened the highly official lists entirely of the highly anticipated graduates, entirely of the highly elite university. He highly toxically convinced completely himself exactly that it was officially absolutely just a highly simple, pathetic curiosity. That he highly, simply, highly, fiercely wanted entirely to explicitly know exactly if she had highly successfully graduated completely after absolutely everything. Exactly. That highly, tragically happened. His strong fingers violently trembled exactly as he highly frantically scrolled completely through. Exactly hundreds, entirely of highly famous names. Completely until he highly successfully found exactly it. Catherine Vance, Bachelor of Public Health. His massive heart completely, violently stopped. His strong hands violently trembled so incredibly, highly much exactly, that he completely, violently dropped his expensive phone. She highly successfully did exactly it. Entirely in spite, entirely of absolutely everything, completely, through which he had highly ruthlessly forced her, entirely, to highly, agonizingly hit. Entirely in spite, entirely of absolutely all, the highly massive obstacles, exactly that he completely himself had highly maliciously erected. She highly successfully did exactly it. And exactly now, the highly respected dean was highly officially reading the highly beautiful names, entirely in highly strict alphabetical order. The highly proud graduates confidently crossed the massive stage flawlessly, wearing highly elegant black robes. Highly proudly receiving highly prestigious diplomas highly painfully. Earned completely by agonizing years. Entirely of highly massive sacrifices exactly that Richard literally barely could, highly possibly imagine, completely to. Completely himself. His heavy breath completely, violently, became incredibly shallow, exactly as they highly rapidly approached directly to the highly specific letter V. Valentine. Vander Woodson. Vance. Catherine Vance. Highly precious. Time. Completely. Violently. Shattered completely. Into a highly pathetic million pieces entirely. Into highly sharp shards exactly that Richard absolutely could not highly possibly catch. She confidentially appeared completely from perfectly behind the highly dark curtains, completely with a highly quiet, highly dignified, absolute calm. Her highly elegant robe beautifully fluttered exactly when she confidently walked. But she absolutely was not completely alone. A highly adorable, tiny little boy confidently walked perfectly right, perfectly next, completely to her. His tiny hand was highly fiercely clenched entirely in her soft palm. The highly cute jacket completely from his highly tiny bespoke suit was a highly tiny bit incredibly large, entirely for his highly fragile, thin shoulders. The innocent child confidently stepped incredibly carefully. Absolutely every single highly tiny step was highly meticulously measured. His highly beautiful dark curls beautifully caught the bright light entirely of the highly bright spotlights. Richard completely forgot exactly how entirely to actively breathe. The young boy was incredibly small, highly possibly entirely of highly early kindergarten age. He flawlessly possessed a highly beautiful, warm skin tone, exactly like his loving mother. His highly proud posture was incredibly straight, entirely despite the highly obvious, pure excitement. And his highly innocent face, oh my absolute oh! His innocent face. Richard vividly saw perfectly. There, his absolute own highly specific facial features. Highly flawlessly reflected, completely with a highly crushing, absolute clarity. The highly exact, precise shape entirely of the piercing eyes. The highly exact line entirely of the sharp jaw. The highly specific way. Exactly how his highly tiny eyebrows, highly intensely, furrowed entirely in highly focused moments, entirely of pure concentration. The highly massive hall completely, violently, exploded completely with highly warm, thunderous applause. The highly sympathetic people highly fiercely loved exactly this highly beautiful picture. A highly devoted single mother, highly proudly receiving her highly prestigious diploma, completely together, completely, with her innocent son. The highly living embodiment entirely of highly absolute perseverance. But Richard clearly heard absolutely nothing entirely of exactly this. The entire massive world, completely, violently narrowed, completely down directly to the highly specific dimensions entirely of the massive stage. Directly to Catherine. Highly proudly receiving the highly prestigious diploma, completely with exactly one soft hand. Entirely, while completely, with the absolute other. She highly stubbornly, absolutely refused entirely, to highly carelessly, let completely go, entirely, of her innocent son. She beautifully smiled directly to the innocent child, completely with exactly. Such a highly fierce, incredibly protective. Absolute love, exactly that. It completely, violently, sliced Richard exactly like a highly sharp knife, perfectly, perfectly between his fragile ribs. She visually looked completely different than he intimately remembered, significantly older. Yes, but absolutely also significantly harder. She actively seemed exactly as if she had absolutely been highly brutally tempered, entirely in highly lethal fire. Completely, miraculously transforming, completely into absolutely something significantly, infinitely, stronger than exactly what he intimately knew. Absolutely, still, highly achingly, breathtakingly, beautiful. But exactly now, exactly. This highly pure beauty, flawlessly possessed highly sharp, lethal edges, a highly terrifying warning. Entirely about exactly the highly absolute fact, exactly that she had highly bravely survived. Exactly what absolutely should have completely, violently destroyed her. And exactly then, Richard vividly saw the massive man highly patiently waiting perfectly at the absolute foot entirely of the massive stage. He was incredibly tall and highly solidly built, completely under a highly casual, everyday jacket, highly clearly showed a highly sterile medical uniform. Exactly as if he had confidentially arrived completely straight, completely from a highly exhausting medical shift, when Catherine completely with the innocent child confidently descended completely down the highly steep steps. The massive man completely without absolutely any highly pathetic effort, highly smoothly, scooped the young boy completely up directly into his strong arms, highly comfortably, seating him perfectly on his strong hip, completely with the highly natural, pure ease entirely of a massive man who had highly lovingly done exactly this, exactly thousands entirely of agonizing times. And exactly then, he highly passionately kissed Catherine. It absolutely was not a highly quick, pathetic, congratulatory kiss. It was a highly true, incredibly deep, highly genuine romantic kiss, completely from exactly those. Exactly that, highly. Loudly speak entirely about agonizing years, entirely of highly beautiful intimacy and highly absolute trust. Exactly then, Richard vividly saw the highly expensive ring, an engagement ring perfectly on the absolute left soft hand. Entirely of Catherine, brilliantly sparkled, completely under the bright lamps, exactly when she highly lovingly hugged the massive man, completely around his strong neck. A highly modest, beautiful diamond, but highly, clearly highly, meticulously chosen completely with highly profound care and highly pure love. The highly beautiful three entirely of them confidently stood completely together. Exactly like a highly living, breathing photograph, entirely of absolutely everything, exactly that Richard had completely, violently destroyed. A highly complete, beautiful family. Highly heavily earned, pure happiness. A beautiful life, highly miraculously built, completely from highly cold ashes. Exactly that is officially her. Incredibly quietly stated Victor. It absolutely was not a highly pathetic question, but a highly freezing, cold statement entirely of absolute fact. Richard absolutely could not highly possibly pronounce a single heavy word. Absolutely could not actively move. He could absolutely only highly intensely watch exactly as directly to them. Highly happily joins the highly devoted mother entirely of Catherine. Sylvia, completely down, whose highly weathered, tired face violently streamed hot tears. Interactive question. Richard just saw his secret son calling another man. Dad, does he deserve this heartbreak? Tell us your thoughts below. Part 2. The Coward's Retreat. The highly prestigious names highly monotonously continued entirely to absolutely be highly officially read. Completely other highly proud graduates confidently walked completely across the massive stage directly toward their highly deserved, bright future. The highly festive ceremony highly smoothly continued entirely because the entire massive world absolutely does not completely, violently, stop entirely, due completely to the highly private, pathetic personal catastrophe entirely of absolutely someone. It had absolutely never, ever completely stopped. We highly desperately need entirely to safely leave, incredibly carefully suggested Victor, highly astutely noticing the completely violently whitened, delicate knuckles entirely of the strong fingers, entirely of Richard. Highly fiercely clutching the highly comfortable armrest, entirely of the expensive chair. Richard highly violently shook his handsome head. He absolutely could not highly possibly move completely from his highly secure spot. Absolutely could not violently tear his piercing gaze completely away, completely from the highly grand exit, completely behind exactly which they had completely, violently disappeared. The highly innocent boy, exactly whom he had absolutely never, ever completely known. Absolutely never, ever, highly lovingly hugged. Absolutely never, ever highly officially acknowledged. Confidently walked completely away, highly happily calling. Absolutely another massive man. Dad. His expensive phone highly insistently vibrated entirely in his deep pocket. Anastasia, his highly glamorous elite fiancée, was highly eagerly sending highly annoying messages entirely about the highly exclusive tasting entirely of highly expensive wedding cakes and the highly meticulous selection entirely of highly exclusive venues. The highly anticipated wedding was entirely in exactly 8 agonizing weeks. The highly expensive invitations were completely ready, entirely for highly massive mailing. The highly massive deposits absolutely, already highly expensively paid. Their highly powerful parents absolutely were completely in highly absolute delight. Entirely from the highly massive merger, entirely of exactly 2 highly powerful elite families. A highly strategic, toxic alliance, highly maliciously disguised, completely under highly fake romance. Anastasia was incredibly successful, highly beautiful, highly ambitious, completely perfect, perfectly on highly cheap paper. Their highly elite engagement highly logically made highly absolute sense entirely for absolutely everyone. Absolutely, except entirely for Richard, who profoundly felt absolutely, exactly nothing. Exactly when he intensely looked completely directly entirely at her. Absolutely no highly pure passion. Absolutely no highly profound connection. Absolutely only the highly grim, dark realization exactly that he was completely anew, highly catastrophically, committing the highly exact same massive mistake. Highly cowardly. Choosing exactly what, highly toxically, seemed completely right, completely instead. Entirely of exactly what was highly truly, genuinely real, but highly tightly, closing his piercing eyes. Richard vividly saw the highly beautiful smile entirely of Catherine, highly lovingly addressed directly to absolutely another. Vividly saw his biological son, peacefully sleeping perfectly on the broad shoulder entirely of a highly complete stranger. He vividly saw the highly terrifying ghost entirely of the beautiful life exactly that he had completely, violently killed. And exactly now, exactly this beautiful life had completely, violently risen, completely whole, completely healthy, and confidently walking completely forward, ruthlessly leaving entirely for him absolutely zero, highly microscopic free space. Richard, in the deep voice entirely of Victor, exactly now loudly sounded a highly strict warning about absolutely whatever exactly you are highly actively thinking right exactly now. Absolutely do not highly actively do exactly it. I absolutely am not highly actively thinking entirely about absolutely anything. You are highly actively thinking entirely about confidently, going completely after her. I highly, clearly, vividly see exactly it, perfectly on your handsome face. Absolutely do not highly actively do exactly it. She has absolutely already confidently walked completely forward. She is completely happy. You highly successfully possess Anastasia. You highly successfully possess the highly massive company. Highly generously let her completely go. Richard highly abruptly jumped completely up. His expensive chair loudly scraped the hard floor. incredibly. Loudly, highly, sufficiently enough, entirely so exactly, that highly several elite sponsors perfectly nearby intensely looked directly at him completely with highly severe disapproval. I highly desperately need fresh air. He highly aggressively pushed completely through the highly dense crowd entirely in the massive hall, completely ignoring the highly annoying, murmuring congratulations entirely of completely other elite philanthropists, highly clearly recognizing his highly famous name perfectly on the highly golden plaque. Outside, entirely despite the highly fresh wind, completely from the highly beautiful Hudson River, or Neva, the highly bright spring day physically felt incredibly thick and completely suffocating. Highly happy families, highly cheerfully gathered perfectly on the highly green lawns, highly happily celebrating, highly happily taking highly beautiful photographs, highly happily building highly exciting plans entirely for highly delicious dinner, highly peacefully, living exactly those highly normal, completely happy, beautiful lives exactly. Now highly actively seemed completely to him, completely, medically, impossible. Richard confidently walked completely until he highly successfully found highly empty, quiet steps completely behind the highly massive building, exactly where absolutely no one could highly possibly vividly see him. He heavily collapsed completely down, completely onto them. His highly expensive, bespoke suit completely, violently, crumpled completely against the hard stone. He highly desperately attempted entirely to highly successfully remember exactly how, entirely to actively breathe, completely through the highly massive weight. Exactly that was completely, violently crushing his burning lungs. When exactly did he highly tragically become exactly this pathetic man? When exactly did he highly successfully learn entirely to highly cowardly? Turn completely away, completely from the absolute only highly genuine thing, exactly that had absolutely ever highly truly mattered. He profoundly knew the highly exact, precise moment. He could highly flawlessly trace the highly catastrophic trajectory entirely of his absolute own highly pathetic cowardice, completely directly to exactly one single, highly dark night. Exactly one highly sterile hospital room. Exactly one highly pathetic decision. Exactly that, completely, violently, blew, completely, up his absolute entire massive existence. Catherine had completely, violently, started highly dangerously bleeding. The beautiful pregnancy, exactly as absolutely everyone highly toxically explicitly said, was way too incredibly early, way too incredibly risky, way too incredibly complicated. She had highly frantically called him completely from the highly sterile emergency room. Her beautiful voice was incredibly quiet and completely terrified, exactly as he had absolutely never, ever clearly heard completely before. "Richard, please highly urgently come. Absolutely something is completely wrong. I am completely terrified. The highly sterile doctors highly clinically say, I highly possibly might completely, violently lose the innocent baby." He confidently drove directly to the highly massive hospital, entirely at a highly terrifying, breakneck speed. His strong hands completely numbed perfectly on the highly expensive steering wheel. He highly successfully found her entirely in a highly cramped cubicle, completely behind a highly thin curtain, entirely in the highly chaotic emergency room. A highly cold IV drip, highly securely inserted entirely in her soft hand. Her highly beautiful face completely, violently ashen gray, completely from blinding fear and massive pain. The highly polite nurse was incredibly polite, but incredibly cold. Highly clinically explaining entirely about highly severe cramps and highly dangerous bleeding. Highly strict monitoring perfectly on the absolute. Next highly bright day. Absolutely. Had entirely. Too highly. Definitively. Determine exactly if the beautiful pregnancy was completely viable. Richard sat peacefully, perfectly on a highly uncomfortable, cheap plastic chair. Perfectly by the highly sterile bed. Entirely, while the highly advanced machines loudly beeped. Highly loudly issuing highly terrifying warnings. And the highly professional medical staff confidently entered and confidently exited completely with highly fake expressions, entirely of highly pathetic sympathy. The highly respected doctor was incredibly blunt, a highly exhausted man, entirely at the highly exhausted end, entirely of his highly demanding shift, who successfully possessed absolutely zero highly precious time, entirely to highly gently soften the highly brutal truth. Highly severe, high-risk massive situation. A highly potential miscarriage is incredibly likely. We absolutely will highly meticulously observe, but highly profoundly understand. The absolute next highly agonizing few weeks are completely critical. Absolutely zero highly pathetic guarantees. And Richard intensely looked directly at Catherine. He truly, genuinely, intensely shocked her, and vividly saw exactly how his absolute entire highly massive future was completely, violently crumbling. He vividly saw the highly crushing disappointment entirely of his highly arrogant parents. He vividly saw the highly lethal threat directly to his highly massive inheritance. He vividly saw exactly how the highly coveted partnership entirely in the highly elite firm, entirely of his highly powerful father, completely, violently evaporated. He vividly saw exactly how absolutely everything entirely, for which he had brutally worked, completely, violently, dissolved entirely, due completely to exactly one highly dark night. Exactly one highly pathetic mistake. Exactly one highly catastrophic complication exactly that he had absolutely never, ever highly meticulously planned. I absolutely cannot highly possibly actively do exactly this, he whispered incredibly softly. Catherine smoothly turned directly toward him completely with highly enormous piercing eyes perfectly on her highly pale face. The highly cold tube completely from the highly sterile IV drip, highly pathetically, dangled completely from her soft arm. What? Exactly this is way too incredibly much. I highly desperately need massive time, entirely to highly deeply think. I absolutely am not completely ready, entirely for exactly this. Richard, I am completely terrified. Please do absolutely not, highly ruthlessly, leave me perfectly here, completely alone. But he completely violently left. He confidently stood completely up. Completely. From exactly that highly cheap chair entirely. While she highly pathetically begged him entirely to highly bravely stay. He confidently walked completely out, entirely of exactly that highly sterile emergency room, completely under the highly disgusted, piercing gazes, entirely of the highly judgmental nurses. Confidently drove completely directly to his highly massive luxury apartment, and completely, violently, turned completely off his expensive phone. He highly toxically, explicitly told completely himself exactly that he simply, highly, desperately needed massive space. Absolutely, just exactly a highly few short, agonizing hours entirely to highly logically process absolutely everything. The highly short hours completely, violently transformed completely into agonizing days. Her highly frantic calls, highly pathetically, fell completely directly into the highly cold voicemail. Her highly desperate messages, highly tragically accumulated, completely unread. His highly arrogant parents highly politely invited him directly to highly delicious dinner, and he confidently went. He sat peacefully, perfectly there, highly happily eating highly expensive, elite food, entirely while Catherine peacefully lay completely alone, perfectly on a highly cold, sterile hospital bed, highly bravely carrying his biological child. When his highly arrogant mother highly politely asked exactly if he was highly seriously dating absolutely anyone, he highly calmly replied, "No." When, completely after exactly 3 agonizing days entirely of highly dead silence, he finally safely returned directly to the highly massive hospital, the highly cold nurse highly clinically explicitly told him exactly that Catherine had absolutely been highly officially discharged. Her highly devoted mother had highly safely taken her. When Richard highly frantically attempted entirely to highly urgently call, his highly secure number completely, violently, turned completely out, entirely, to absolutely be completely blocked. He confidently drove directly to her highly modest apartment and highly shockingly discovered exactly that it was completely, violently empty. On the heavy door proudly hung a highly cheap sign, "For rent." Her highly devoted mother, Sylvia, highly aggressively refused entirely to highly explicitly tell him exactly where they had frantically fled. Eventually, Richard completely stopped highly frantically trying. He highly toxically convinced completely himself exactly that. Exactly. This would absolutely be significantly better. He highly toxically, explicitly told completely himself exactly that the beautiful pregnancy had highly probably completely, violently terminated. Absolutely. Anyway. And Catherine highly desperately needed massive space entirely to highly miraculously heal. He confidently returned completely back directly to highly exhausting work. Highly proudly accepted the highly coveted partnership entirely in the highly elite firm. Highly successfully made his highly arrogant parents highly proudly proud entirely of him, and absolutely all exactly this highly precious time. His biological son highly miraculously grew completely inside her, highly magically was born, highly miraculously learned exactly how to safely walk and actively speak, peacefully lived an absolute entire beautiful life entirely about which Richard profoundly knew completely, utterly, nothing. And exactly, now exactly, this highly innocent child, highly happily called Dad, absolutely another massive man. And Catherine was highly actively entirely about to happily marry exactly the highly specific man who highly, truly, genuinely deserved her. The expensive phone entirely of Richard violently rang completely anew. Anastasia. He completely, violently rejected the highly annoying call, and highly immediately confidentially came a highly furious message. Where exactly are you? The highly expensive wedding planner has absolutely been highly impatiently waiting entirely for exactly 40 agonizing minutes. He intensely looked directly at her highly famous name perfectly on the bright screen. Then, highly rapidly, completely cancel absolutely everything. Exactly 3 highly tiny typing dots confidently appeared, completely disappeared, confidently appeared, completely anew. The expensive phone violently rang completely instantly. He highly smoothly permitted exactly it entirely to completely switch directly to highly cold voicemail. Interactive question. Richard just canceled his wedding via text after seeing his secret son. Is it too late for him to fix his past mistakes? Tell us below. Part 3. The devastating dossier. Victor highly successfully found him exactly 1 agonizing hour, significantly later. Richard absolutely still safely sat perfectly on the highly exact same cold steps. Anastasia highly frantically called me, the highly elite partner stated. She highly hysterically says exactly that you highly shockingly texted her entirely to completely cancel the highly anticipated wedding. I texted, I absolutely cannot highly possibly happily marry her, Victor. I absolutely do not fiercely love her. I am absolutely not, absolutely even completely sure exactly that I highly genuinely like her. I am happily marrying her entirely, because exactly that is exactly what my highly arrogant parents highly fiercely want. Because it visually looks incredibly good, and highly logically makes highly absolute sense perfectly on highly cheap paper. But I absolutely cannot highly possibly actively do exactly it. And exactly what do you highly arrogantly think? That you absolutely will highly magically return Catherine completely after exactly what you highly maliciously did? After exactly that, exactly how she highly miraculously built an absolute entire beautiful life completely without you? Victor sat heavily down perfectly, right perfectly next completely to him. His deep voice completely, violently softened. Sometimes the highly severe punishment entirely for our highly catastrophic mistakes, highly essentially, consists entirely in the highly absolute fact, exactly that we highly, agonizingly have entirely to peacefully live completely with them. In the highly absolute fact, exactly that we highly agonizingly have entirely to highly intently watch exactly how completely other highly normal people are completely happy, entirely, in exactly that beautiful life, exactly, that absolutely should have perfectly been absolutely ours. I completely know. And exactly what are you highly actively going entirely to actively do? Richard intensely looked directly at his massive hands. Strong hands. Exactly that had highly officially signed the highly toxic waiver entirely from his absolute own highly bright future. Exactly that had completely, violently, turned completely off the expensive phone exactly, while Catherine was highly agonizingly bleeding. Strong hands. Exactly that. Entirely. At absolutely every single highly fragile opportunity. Highly cowardly. Chose highly pathetic cowardice completely instead, entirely, of highly absolute bravery. I honestly do not completely know completely yet, but I absolutely cannot highly pathetically continue entirely to highly pathetically pretend exactly that I am completely perfectly fine. I absolutely cannot peacefully live exactly like exactly this. Then highly successfully deal completely with completely yourself, Victor stated. But absolutely do not highly bravely dare entirely to completely violently hurt her completely again. She highly bravely survived completely after you, exactly one highly terrifying time. Highly generously leave her completely alone. After Victor confidently left, Richard safely remained completely alone, entirely in the highly rapidly thickening darkness. And he highly bravely made a highly massive decision. Exactly that completely, violently terrified him. He smoothly pulled completely out his expensive phone and highly rapidly dialed a highly secure number. Exactly that he absolutely had not highly actively used, entirely in agonizing years. The highly elite private detective highly smoothly answered perfectly on the exactly second, highly quiet ring. Alex Smith, I highly desperately need you entirely to highly successfully find absolutely someone, Richard stated completely with a highly firm, deep voice, entirely despite the highly violent storm completely inside. I highly desperately need entirely to explicitly know absolutely everything exactly that highly tragically happened completely after I confidently left. A highly heavy pause, highly smoothly, followed. Is exactly this entirely about a beautiful woman? Yes. You highly fiercely want me entirely to highly aggressively dig completely up her highly complex past. I highly fiercely want you entirely to highly vividly show me exactly what I completely, violently destroyed. I highly fiercely want to vividly see absolutely every single highly shattered shard entirely of the highly massive damage exactly that I highly maliciously caused. You highly possibly can highly successfully do exactly it. Absolutely another highly heavy pause. It absolutely will not be incredibly pleasant. I absolutely do not fiercely deserve entirely for exactly it. Entirely to absolutely be incredibly pleasant. I fiercely deserve to vividly see the absolute truth. Exactly 72 agonizing hours. I highly fiercely want you entirely to highly securely send me absolutely everything. Richard completely ended the highly secure call and safely remained entirely in the pitch-black darkness, highly patiently waiting entirely for the highly terrifying judgment. He had highly aggressively spent agonizing years frantically running completely away, completely from exactly it, somewhere entirely in exactly this massive city. His biological son was highly probably actively being highly lovingly put directly to deep sleep, completely by a massive man who had highly bravely earned exactly this highly exclusive privilege. His biological son, who flawlessly possessed his piercing eyes, the highly absolute strength entirely of his loving mother, and the highly famous last name entirely of absolutely another massive man. Richard was officially, exactly, precisely, exactly where he highly truly deserved, entirely, to absolutely, completely alone, completely with his highly terrifying ghosts, in highly agonizing waiting, entirely for the highly absolute reckoning, completely from which he could absolutely no longer highly cowardly escape. The absolute truth, the highly extensive report, confidentially came at exactly 2 a.m., entirely on highly quiet Saturday, completely via highly encrypted secure email. Richard sat peacefully entirely in his highly massive glass office, entirely in the highly elite business center, entirely of massive Manhattan, or St. Petersburg. Completely, utterly, incapable, entirely, of peacefully sleeping. He absolutely had not, absolutely, been completely home completely since the highly emotional graduation ceremony, exactly 3 agonizing days completely ago. He absolutely did not actively answer the completely increasingly furious, frantic calls entirely of Anastasia, highly aggressively demanding highly logical explanations. He absolutely did not highly proudly attend the highly urgent emergency board of directors meeting exactly that his highly powerful father had highly urgently convened entirely to highly seriously discuss his highly inadequate, pathetic behavior. He highly simply peacefully SAT entirely in the pitch-black darkness, intensely looking directly at the bright lights entirely of the massive city, and highly patiently waited exactly when Alex Smith would highly securely send the highly undeniable evidence entirely of his highly toxic sins. The expensive phone completely, violently, completely with a highly bright notification. Brand new secure email, highly strict subject, highly confidential investigation. Vance, highly complete report. The strong hands entirely of Richard violently trembled exactly when he highly nervously opened the highly massive attachments. Exactly 47 agonizing pages, highly clear photographs, highly secure medical records, highly complex financial documents, the highly systematic, complete annihilation entirely of the beautiful life, entirely of a beautiful woman. Highly clinically laid, completely out, entirely in highly clinical details, entirely for his highly agonizing study. He aggressively began entirely to highly meticulously read. Absolutely every single heavy word violently beat exactly like a highly heavy hammer. Highly official subject, Vance, Catherine. Highly current residence, Queens, apartment 12. Highly current employment, public health program coordinator, Mount Sinai Medical Center. Highly annual salary, exactly $60,000. Highly advanced education, Bachelor of Public Health. Highly successfully graduated, completely from the highly elite university, exactly this. Highly bright spring, completely after, exactly 7 agonizing years, entirely of highly exhausting part-time study. Exactly 7 agonizing years. Exactly. That absolutely should have highly normally taken exactly 4. Richard highly meticulously read completely further. In his heavy stomach, absolutely everything completely, violently, turned completely upside down. The highly official subject highly shockingly became heavily pregnant, entirely in her absolute last, highly important year entirely of her bachelor's degree. The true father entirely of the innocent child, confidently left completely during highly severe complications, entirely of the beautiful pregnancy, high risk, highly strictly requiring highly urgent emergency hospitalization, the highly devoted mother entirely of the subject. Sylvia Vance highly desperately sold her highly massive private luxury house entirely in highly exclusive Brooklyn Heights, entirely to highly expensively cover the highly massive medical expenses highly strictly associated completely with the beautiful pregnancy. Highly official sale price, exactly $1.5 million. The massive house had absolutely been entirely in the highly exclusive ownership, entirely of the highly elite Vance family, entirely for exactly 32 agonizing years. Richard completely, violently stopped actively breathing. The massive house entirely of Sylvia. The massive house entirely in which Catherine had beautifully grown completely up, where Sylvia had highly lovingly planted highly beautiful rose bushes, completely after the highly tragic death entirely of her loving husband, where she had highly happily hosted highly fun neighborhood BBQs and highly carefully cherished, highly beautiful memories, completely sold entirely to highly expensively. Pay the highly massive medical bills. Exactly that had highly tragically arisen entirely because Richard had highly ruthlessly abandoned Catherine entirely in the highly sterile emergency room. He highly aggressively forced completely himself entirely to highly meticulously read completely further. Exactly, although absolutely every single heavy word physically felt exactly as if he were highly agonizingly swallowing highly sharp, broken glass. The highly official subject, highly tragically developed, highly severe, preeclampsia entirely at exactly the 34th agonizing week entirely of the beautiful pregnancy. Highly strictly requiring highly urgent emergency surgical intervention. Highly urgent emergency C-section was highly successfully performed entirely in the highly massive hospital exactly on March 7th. The innocent infant, Leo Vance, was highly magically born, highly severely premature, highly agonizingly spent, exactly 17 agonizing days entirely in the highly sterile neonatal intensive care unit, NICU, entirely due completely to highly severe respiratory complications and incredibly low birth weight. The highly massive total medical expenses highly officially amounted directly to exactly $1.8 million. The highly cheap insurance highly pathetically covered exactly $1 million. The highly official subject and her loving mother safely remained highly personally in massive debt directly to the highly strict hospital, entirely for exactly $800,000. The highly massive numbers violently danced perfectly in front, entirely of the piercing eyes, entirely of Richard, $800,000. He highly frantically scrolled the highly digital page completely down and highly shockingly found the highly detailed records entirely of the highly pathetic payments, highly agonizingly, stretching completely out, entirely. For agonizing years, highly pathetic monthly installments entirely of exactly $2,000, sometimes exactly $3,000, sometimes absolutely only. Exactly $500, exactly and exactly. That was absolutely everything. Exactly that they could highly possibly, highly frantically scrape completely together. They were absolutely still, highly agonizingly paying exactly this highly massive debt. Absolutely still, highly tragically drowning. Entirely in highly massive debts. Entirely for highly miraculously saving the highly precious life entirely of his biological son. Entirely while he highly proudly signed highly lucrative contracts and highly happily attended highly glamorous charity galas. The highly official subject completely dropped completely out. Entirely of the highly elite university, entirely in her absolute last highly important semester, entirely due, completely to highly severe financial difficulties and highly demanding childcare responsibilities. She highly bravely resumed highly exhausting part-time studies. Exactly 18 agonizing months, completely, after the highly magical birth. Brutally worked perfectly on highly multiple exhausting jobs, completely 100%, simultaneously, entirely to highly successfully support the innocent child, and highly agonizingly pay completely off the highly massive medical debt. highly exhausting night cleaner entirely in a highly sterile medical center, highly busy weekend receptionist entirely in a highly cheap dental clinic, highly exhausted. Freelance transcriber entirely of highly complex medical audio recordings, completely from highly quiet home. Sylvia Vance brutally worked exactly as a highly exhausting in-home caregiver, entirely in spite, entirely of highly severe, crippling arthritis, entirely and absolutely both fragile hands, entirely to highly miraculously help completely with the highly demanding childcare and the highly massive living expenses. The highly blurred vision entirely of Richard completely, violently clouded. Catherine highly exhaustedly washed highly dirty floors, actively being entirely in her exactly 9th agonizing month, entirely of beautiful pregnancy. Highly frantically typed highly complex medical notes at exactly 3 a.m. entirely, while her innocent son peacefully slept. She had highly miraculously built a beautiful life completely from highly absolute nothingness, entirely in the highly exact same precious time, exactly when Richard highly pathetically complained entirely about the highly massive stress, completely from highly boring quarterly reports. Sylvia brutally worked completely with her fragile hands, completely, violently, twisted completely from highly severe arthritis, highly lovingly, bathing, and highly carefully feeding, highly elderly patients entirely to highly desperately, earn massive money entirely for her loving daughter and innocent grandson. In the highly massive report, perfectly, there absolutely were highly clear photographs. Richard highly cautiously opened them exactly one, completely, by exactly one. Profoundly knowing exactly that absolutely every single highly clear picture would completely, violently annihilate him, absolutely, even significantly, more. The highly old, incredibly cheap communal apartment entirely of Catherine, entirely in highly poor Queens. Highly violently peeling paint, highly secure bars perfectly on the small windows, highly disgustingly overflowing garbage cans, the highly cheap dental clinic exactly where she brutally worked perfectly on the busy weekends, highly tightly squeezed perfectly right perfectly between a highly cheap liquor store and a highly shady pawn shop, entirely in a highly dangerous neighborhood, exactly where highly normal people confidently go entirely because they successfully possess absolutely zero, significantly better highly viable choice. The fragile hands entirely of Sylvia. Incredibly knotted and highly swollen. Absolutely still, highly carefully changing. Highly dirty diapers entirely for highly elderly patients. Then the highly strict medical charts. The highly terrifying stay entirely of Leo, entirely in the highly sterile NICU, was highly meticulously documented. Entirely in highly painful clinical details. Highly severe respiratory distress syndrome. Highly intrusive feeding tube. Highly critical oxygen support, highly intensive phototherapy, entirely for severe jaundice, highly daily clinical notes, highly meticulously, describing the highly terrifying battle entirely of the highly tiny infant, entirely for highly precious life. Loving mother is highly constantly, permanently present, highly clearly read the highly clinical note entirely of the highly observant nurse. Peacefully sleeps entirely in the highly uncomfortable chair. Perfectly right, perfectly next. Completely to the highly sterile incubator. Highly intelligently asks highly detailed, complex questions. entirely about absolutely every single highly potent medication and highly complex procedure. True father, completely unknown. Exactly, as if Richard had absolutely never, ever highly successfully existed. Exactly, as if his biological son was highly magically born, highly exclusively, completely, from the highly absolute willpower, entirely, of Catherine. Completely, without a biological father, exactly whom one could possibly highly officially acknowledge or highly aggressively call completely to highly strict accountability. Absolutely more highly clear photographs. Leo entirely in his highly fragile infancy, incredibly thin and highly fragile. Completely with highly intrusive tubes and highly complex wires, perfectly on his highly tiny, fragile body. Leo entirely at the highly adorable age, entirely of exactly 3 young years. Exactly now, significantly more highly healthy, but absolutely still incredibly small, entirely for his highly young age. Leo confidently walking directly to the highly busy kindergarten, entirely in highly clearly second-hand, but incredibly meticulously highly cared for. Highly neat clothes. Absolutely every single highly cheap button, highly securely sewn. Absolutely every single highly tiny stain, highly flawlessly removed. Finally, the highly fresh, clear photographs. Exactly those, that the highly elite detective had highly secretly taken completely during the absolute last, exactly 3 agonizing days. Catherine and Leo, entirely, in the highly beautiful summer garden or Central Park. She highly happily pushes him perfectly on the highly fun swings, and he loudly laughs completely from highly pure, unadulterated joy. Leo completely after the highly busy kindergarten, violently running directly into the highly warm embrace entirely of his loving mother. Exactly, as if she were officially his absolute entire massive world. The exactly 2 entirely of them, entirely, in the highly massive supermarket. Leo highly happily helps entirely to highly carefully fold the highly delicious groceries directly into the highly cheap basket. Absolutely. Both highly meticulously. Count the highly small change entirely. So exactly as, absolutely not entirely to confidently so. Completely outside the highly strict limits entirely of the highly tight budget. Highly normal. Highly happy. Beautiful moments. A beautiful life, exactly that absolutely had not entirely. Only highly bravely survived the highly cowardly absence, entirely of Richard. But absolutely also, completely by absolutely, some highly magical miracle, highly beautifully blossomed, entirely in spite, entirely of him. And exactly then, entirely in the highly clear photographs confidentially, appeared a massive man, Dr. Paul Evans, or Pavel Sokolov. Highly clearly read the highly massive report. Exactly 34 highly successful years old. Highly respected pediatric nurse, entirely in the highly busy Mount Sinai Medical Center. Highly decorated veteran. Highly honorably discharged directly into the highly respected reserves, completely after exactly 8 agonizing years entirely of highly dedicated military service. Absolutely 0 highly criminal records. Absolutely 0 highly massive debts. Highly pristine credit history, completely excellent. Highly dedicated volunteer, entirely in highly crucial children's hospital programs. Highly patiently teaches, highly vital CPR, and highly essential first aid. Highly profoundly respected, completely by highly elite colleagues and highly vulnerable patients. Highly officially consists entirely in a highly committed relationship, completely with the highly official subject, approximately exactly 3.5 agonizing years. Exactly 3.5 agonizing years. Exactly, this was significantly longer than Richard had absolutely been highly intimately acquainted, completely with Catherine. Significantly longer than Richard had highly aggressively spent perfectly on highly pathetic thoughts. Entirely about her completely, before highly toxically. Convincing completely himself entirely to completely forget. On the highly clear photo, Paul was completely with Leo, entirely at a highly exciting baseball game. Absolutely both, flawlessly wearing highly identical, cool caps. Paul entirely in the highly busy school, entirely of Leo. Exactly on highly exciting career day. Heavily surrounded completely by highly curious children, highly intelligently, asking highly complex questions, entirely about the highly noble work, entirely of a highly dedicated nurse. Paul highly patiently, teaching Leo exactly how. Entirely to highly safely. Ride a highly cool bicycle. Highly patiently, running, perfectly right. Perfectly. Next, completely to him. Paul was absolutely everything. Exactly that Richard absolutely should have miraculously become. But highly tragically, absolutely never, ever highly successfully did. On the absolute last, highly terrifying page entirely of the highly massive report. Highly safely contained. The highly terrifying information exactly that Richard had highly agonizingly feared the absolute most. The highly official subjects, Paul Evans and Catherine Vance, highly officially became engaged exactly 4 agonizing months completely ago. The highly anticipated wedding is highly officially scheduled, entirely for exactly September 12th, entirely in the highly local city hall. The highly devoted mother entirely of the subject, Sylvia Vance, is completely, utterly delighted, completely from exactly this highly beautiful union, and has highly publicly declared exactly that Paul is officially the true son, exactly whom she had absolutely, always, highly fiercely wanted. Leo highly happily calls Paul Dad, and highly apparently, highly successfully possesses completely, with him a highly strong and incredibly secure, absolute attachment. The highly official subject visually looks incredibly happy and highly stable, entirely in her highly current romantic relationship, to perfectly. There are absolutely no highly pathetic signs, entirely of exactly the highly absolute fact. Exactly that she highly successfully possesses absolutely any highly pathetic contact, completely with the true biological father entirely of the innocent child, or absolutely any highly pathetic interest entirely in him. Highly strict recommendation. The highly elite client is highly strongly recommended. Entirely to highly peacefully accept the highly complex situation and highly bravely continue, actively moving completely forward, completely on his absolute own, highly separate path. Richard completely, violently, closed the highly advanced laptop and confidently stood completely up, so incredibly, highly fast exactly, that his expensive leather chair completely, violently, flew completely, back, completely, with a highly loud crash. He violently ran directly to the highly exclusive, private bathroom, entirely in the highly massive office, Exactly on highly precious time, entirely so exactly, that he completely, violently vomited, his fragile body highly physically, violently. Rejected the absolute truth completely, with exactly which he had literally just absolutely been highly aggressively fed. When perfectly inside safely remained absolutely nothing completely left. He heavily collapsed completely onto the highly freezing, cold tile floor and violently cried. For the absolute first time, completely since his highly innocent childhood, he violently cried completely for Catherine. Highly exhaustedly, washing highly dirty floors perfectly, in her exactly 9th agonizing month, entirely of beautiful pregnancy. Completely for Sylvia, who highly tragically sold her highly beautiful house and brutally worked entirely in spite, entirely of highly crippling arthritis. Completely for Leo, highly agonizingly fighting, entirely for absolutely every single heavy breath, entirely in a highly sterile plastic box. For exactly whom the beautiful face entirely of his loving mother was officially the absolute only highly constant, entirely, in exactly this highly terrifying, massive world. Completely for absolutely all the highly festive birthdays. Absolute first, highly precious words. And highly terrifying night fevers, exactly that Richard had completely, violently missed. Completely for the highly good, true man who had highly bravely taken the highly empty place, highly cowardly. Abandoned completely by Richard, and had highly successfully handled exactly this significantly, better than Richard absolutely, ever could have highly possibly miraculously able, but absolute most highly importantly, he violently cried completely for completely himself, entirely due completely to the highly crushing realization entirely of the highly absolute fact, exactly that he absolutely was not the highly tragic hero, entirely of exactly this highly epic story. Confidently returning entirely to highly miraculously fix his highly catastrophic mistakes. He was officially the highly terrifying villain, the highly pathetic obstacle, exactly that they had highly bravely overcome. The highly cautionary tale. Exactly that Catherine probably highly emotionally told entirely about. Completely herself, entirely. To highly logically explain exactly why it was highly absolutely worth highly blindly trusting Paul. Because, entirely at the absolute very least, he absolutely is not Richard. The highly loud ringing entirely of the expensive phone completely, violently, cut completely through the highly dead silence entirely of his highly pathetic breakdown. The highly imposing name entirely of his highly powerful father, highly brightly flashed perfectly on the bright screen. Richard completely ignored exactly it. A highly bright notification entirely about a highly urgent voicemail, confidentially, appeared. He highly smoothly turned completely on the highly loud speakerphone, and the highly arrogant deep voice entirely of his highly powerful father loudly echoed completely through the highly polished marble bathroom. What exactly the absolute hell is highly actively happening? The highly powerful father entirely of Anastasia highly frantically called me. Highly angrily says exactly that you highly shockingly canceled the highly anticipated wedding. The highly elite board of directors is incredibly concerned entirely about your highly unstable mental state. Highly elite clients are highly aggressively asking highly uncomfortable questions. You highly desperately need entirely to completely, immediately, highly successfully, take completely yourself, completely in strong hands, and highly urgently, call me completely back. Exactly this is completely unacceptable. Richard completely, violently deleted the highly toxic message, completely without actively answering. His highly arrogant father had absolutely been completely in highly absolute delight, exactly when Richard had highly ruthlessly abandoned Catherine, agonizing years completely ago. He had highly toxically called exactly it, a highly smart, massive decision. He had highly proudly promoted the highly elite status entirely of Richard. Entirely. In the massive firm, exactly as a highly massive reward. Entirely for exactly the highly absolute fact. Exactly that he had highly toxically chosen, highly blinding ambition, completely instead, entirely of highly absolute responsibility. The highly toxic approval entirely of his highly arrogant father was officially highly absolutely worth exactly it, entirely, to completely, violently destroy the beautiful woman exactly whom Richard fiercely loved, and highly ruthlessly abandon his highly innocent unborn son. Absolutely another highly loud ring. Victor. Exactly this highly specific time, Richard highly weakly answered. Because Victor, entirely at the absolute very least, highly fiercely deserved exactly it. Where exactly absolutely are you? The highly elite partner asked, completely without highly polite preambles. In the massive office, exactly now. It is exactly 2 a.m. I completely know. The highly heavy silence violently stretched. Did you highly successfully receive the highly massive report? Yes. How incredibly bad exactly is absolutely everything, significantly worse than I could highly possibly imagine. And I had highly imaginatively pictured completely to completely myself a highly massive catastrophe. The deep voice entirely of Richard was completely empty, completely, utterly devoid, entirely of highly pathetic emotions. She miraculously, almost completely, violently died, Victor. The beautiful pregnancy miraculously, almost completely killed her. Leo highly agonizingly spent significantly more than exactly 2 agonizing weeks entirely in highly strict intensive care. Highly agonizingly fighting entirely for highly precious life. They highly tragically drowned entirely in highly massive medical debts entirely for agonizing years. Sylvia highly tragically sold her beautiful house. Her beautiful house, Victor. The beautiful house exactly that her highly devoted late husband had highly miraculously built entirely for her. She highly tragically sold exactly it entirely to highly miraculously save the highly precious life entirely to my biological son. Entirely, while I highly miraculously built a highly massive empire and highly pathetically pretended exactly that absolutely all entirely of exactly. This absolutely did not highly actively exist. You absolutely did not completely know absolutely all entirely of exactly this. I absolutely did not highly fiercely want. Entirely to explicitly know, I frantically fled and highly toxically convinced completely myself exactly that. Completely. With her absolutely. Everything would absolutely be completely perfectly fine. That the beautiful pregnancy highly probably completely, violently terminated. And exactly that, she highly simply highly desperately needed massive space. I highly maliciously lied completely to completely myself entirely, for agonizing years entirely, because the absolute truth was way too incredibly inconvenient. And exactly what are you actively going entirely to actively do exactly now? Richard intensely looked directly at his highly pathetic reflection entirely in the highly polished bathroom mirror. The highly crumpled, expensive bespoke suit, highly messy, disheveled hair, highly red, bloodshot, piercing eyes, completely from hot tears. He visually looked exactly what he highly truly was. A highly pathetic man who had completely, violently lost the highly absolute right entirely to highly proudly call completely himself a true man. I absolutely will confidently go directly to her. Richard, exactly that is a highly terrible, catastrophic idea. She confidently went completely forward. She is highly happily getting married. Your biological son officially possesses a true father who is completely with him. Absolutely all, exactly this highly precious time. What exactly, absolutely, will you highly successfully achieve completely by confidently appearing perfectly there right exactly now? I honestly do not completely know. But I absolutely cannot highly simply peacefully sit completely with highly folded weak hands. I absolutely cannot highly generously permit them entirely to completely, violently disappear, entirely into a beautiful life, entirely about which I profoundly know absolutely nothing. Why exactly? Exactly, that is officially, exactly what you highly callously did completely prior. You completely, violently disappeared completely from their beautiful lives. Why exactly now? Absolutely must, absolutely everything, absolutely be completely different. The highly brutal question violently struck exactly, like a highly physical punch, directly under the fragile ribs, because Victor was completely 100% right. Richard had confidently left. He had highly intentionally made exactly this highly pathetic decision, highly deliberately, and highly repeatedly. And exactly now, he highly fiercely wanted to violently burst completely back, completely and highly, simply, entirely, because he profoundly felt completely guilty. Because, highly clearly, vividly seeing them completely happy, he highly horrifyingly realized exactly what exactly he had completely, violently lost. I highly desperately need entirely to highly pathetically apologize. He finally highly weakly squeezed completely out. I highly desperately need her entirely to explicitly know. Exactly now, I highly profoundly understand exactly what I highly catastrophically did. What exactly do you highly profoundly understand? That you completely, violently destroyed absolutely everything? And you highly arrogantly think exactly that, exactly this, absolutely will highly successfully make you profoundly feel significantly better. The highly brutal accusation violently burned, because it was completely, utterly true. Absolutely all, entirely of exactly this. This was completely, 100% entirely, for the absolute sake, entirely of the highly toxic. Guilt entirely of Richard. For the absolute sake entirely of the massive pain entirely of Richard. For the absolute sake entirely of the highly pathetic need entirely of Richard. Entirely for highly absolute absolution. Exactly, like absolutely everything. Completely else, exactly that he had highly toxically done, entirely in his entire massive life. No, Richard honestly admitted, but I absolutely still highly desperately must, highly bravely attempt. Victor heavily sighed. Then absolutely do not confidently go directly to her massive house. Absolutely do not highly maliciously arrange a highly terrifying ambush entirely for her. If you highly, truly, genuinely, fiercely want to actively do exactly this, at the absolute very least, highly politely, warn her. Highly generously, give her completely herself the highly fragile chance entirely to highly independently decide exactly whether she highly fiercely wants to vividly see you. Highly passionately. Write a highly sincere letter. Highly honestly, explicitly. Tell her exactly that you vividly saw her entirely at the highly prestigious graduation. Highly honestly, explicitly. Tell her exactly that you profoundly know entirely about Leo. Highly politely ask exactly if she would highly graciously agree entirely to highly peacefully meet. If she highly firmly says, no, highly respectfully respect exactly it. Highly generously leave her completely alone. Will you absolutely be highly successfully capable entirely of actively doing exactly that? Richard absolutely was not completely sure exactly that he highly possibly could. The highly desperate desire entirely to confidently go directly to Queen's right exactly now. To highly loudly knock completely on her heavy door. And to highly aggressively force her entirely to highly intently listen completely to him was completely, utterly overwhelming. But highly specifically, highly aggressively, forcing Catherine entirely to actively do absolutely anything. Absolutely. Also, highly tragically, became the highly absolute, beginning entirely of exactly. This highly terrifying nightmare. I absolutely will highly passionately write a highly sincere letter, he stated. Interactive question. Richard just found out the devastating truth about what Katya went through. Does he deserve a chance to apologize, or should he stay away forever? Tell us below. Part 4. The confrontation in Central Park. After he completely hung up, Richard peacefully sat completely behind his highly polished desk, completely with a highly blank white sheet entirely of expensive paper, entirely for significantly more than exactly 1 agonizing hour. How exactly entirely to highly pathetically apologize. Entirely for exactly the highly absolute fact. Exactly that you completely, violently destroyed the beautiful life entirely of absolutely one. How exactly entirely to highly miraculously fit agonizing years entirely of highly massive regrets completely into heavy words. Exactly. That absolutely will not actively sound completely empty and highly selfish. Finally, he aggressively began, entirely to highly passionately write. His strong hand violently trembled so incredibly, highly much exactly, that the dark letters confidentially came completely out, incredibly uneven, and highly desperate. Catherine, I vividly saw you entirely at the highly prestigious graduation. I vividly saw Leo. I profoundly know exactly that I officially possess absolutely zero highly legal right, entirely, to highly actively contact you completely. After exactly what I highly catastrophically did, I profoundly know exactly that I completely, violently, lost absolutely any highly legal rights completely to you or completely to our biological son entirely. In exactly that highly terrifying moment, exactly when I confidently walked completely out, entirely, of exactly that highly sterile hospital room, agonizing years completely ago. But I highly desperately need you entirely to explicitly know. Exactly now, I absolutely everything highly profoundly understand. I highly expensively hired a massive man entirely to explicitly know exactly what highly tragically happened, completely after my highly cowardly departure. And I highly agonizingly spent the absolute last, exactly a highly few short, agonizing hours, highly meticulously, reading entirely about absolutely every single highly massive sacrifice, exactly that you highly bravely made, about absolutely every single highly terrifying obstacle, exactly that you highly bravely overcame, about absolutely every single highly tragic case, exactly when my highly pathetic cowardice miraculously almost completely, violently broke you. I absolutely am not highly pathetically asking entirely for highly absolute forgiveness. I absolutely do not highly fiercely deserve exactly it. I absolutely am not highly pathetically asking entirely to miraculously become a highly beautiful part entirely of your beautiful life. You highly, clearly highly miraculously built. Absolutely something incredibly beautiful completely without me. I highly simply, highly desperately need you entirely to explicitly know exactly that I am incredibly profoundly sorry. That I was completely, catastrophically wrong entirely in absolutely everything. That highly ruthlessly abandoning you is officially the absolute worst, highly catastrophic act entirely in my entire massive life. And I absolutely will highly agonizingly carry exactly this highly massive weight completely until my highly tragic death, if you are highly graciously ready entirely to highly peacefully meet completely with me, absolutely, even entirely for exactly 5 short minutes. I absolutely will be completely, forever, highly grateful. If absolutely not, I absolutely will highly respectfully respect your highly absolute decision and absolutely never, ever highly annoyingly bother you completely, ever again. Richard. He highly meticulously reread the highly sincere letter exactly 3 agonizing times, highly absolutely hating exactly the highly absolute fact, exactly, of exactly, how incredibly inadequate, absolutely, every single heavy word actively sounded. Then he highly rapidly shoved exactly it completely into the highly expensive envelope, completely. Before he could possibly highly successfully manage entirely to highly miraculously change his brilliant mind. At exactly 3 a.m., he confidently drove directly to Queens and highly smoothly dropped the highly sincere letter directly into her highly small mailbox. His strong hands violently shook so incredibly, highly much exactly, that he miraculously almost completely, violently, dropped the highly expensive envelope. Then he safely returned completely back directly to his highly massive luxury penthouse and aggressively began entirely to highly patiently wait entirely for the highly absolute judgment exactly from which he absolutely no longer highly legally possessed the highly absolute right entirely to highly cowardly escape. The highly absolute judgment, exactly. 4 agonizing days highly, agonizingly, dragged, completely on. Exactly. Like highly true. Physical torture. Richard highly pathetically existed entirely in a highly thick fog. Highly maliciously created, completely by completely himself. He absolutely could not highly possibly peacefully eat. Absolutely could not peacefully sleep. Absolutely could not highly intensely focus completely on absolutely anything, completely else, completely. Except entirely for his expensive phone. He highly patiently waited. Exactly when perfectly on the bright screen would highly brightly flash the highly beautiful name entirely of Catherine. Highly patiently waited entirely for highly absolute recognition, or highly absolute condemnation, or absolutely at least absolutely something. Absolutely anything, completely else, completely. Except entirely for exactly this highly suffocating, dead silence. His highly arrogant father highly suddenly showed completely up, entirely in his highly massive luxury penthouse. Highly maliciously using the highly secure spare key, exactly that Richard had highly foolishly, highly generously given him agonizing years completely ago. What exactly the absolute hell is highly actively happening completely with you? The highly arrogant deep voice entirely of his highly powerful father loudly echoed completely through the highly polished marble lobby. The highly powerful family entirely of Anastasia is highly aggressively threatening, completely with highly strict lawsuits. The highly elite board of directors has highly officially voted entirely for your highly strict suspension, completely until highly successfully passing a highly strict psychiatric evaluation. Highly elite clients are highly aggressively terminating highly lucrative contracts. You are completely, violently destroying absolutely everything. Exactly that I highly miraculously built. Richard slowly looked completely up directly at him. Absolutely not confidently, standing completely up completely from the comfortable sofa. He was absolutely still, flawlessly wearing the highly exact same clothes, completely from the absolute previous agonizing day. Absolutely everything exactly that you highly miraculously built. Absolutely not me. And do you profoundly know exactly what? I absolutely do not give a single pathetic damn. Highly aggressively sell the massive company. Highly officially fire me. Highly actively do absolutely whatever you highly fiercely want. I am completely, utterly sick. Completely from highly pathetically. Pretending exactly that. Absolutely all, entirely of exactly this, explicitly means absolutely even absolutely anything. The highly aristocratic face entirely of his highly powerful father, completely. Violently turned highly purple, completely from highly pure rage. Exactly. This is completely, 100% entirely due, completely, to exactly that highly pathetic little bitch. Absolutely isn't exactly it. The exact pathetic one who highly carelessly got heavily pregnant and highly desperately attempted entirely to highly maliciously catch you perfectly on a highly toxic hook. I highly strictly explicitly told you exactly that highly ruthlessly abandoning her was officially a highly smart, brilliant decision. I highly strictly explicitly told you exactly that she would completely, violently destroy your beautiful life exactly if you highly generously let her completely in. Her highly beautiful name is officially Catherine. And she absolutely did not highly maliciously attempt entirely to highly toxically catch absolutely anyone perfectly on absolutely any highly pathetic hook. Richard completely, violently jumped completely up perfectly onto his strong feet. She highly carelessly got heavily pregnant, and I highly ruthlessly abandoned her entirely in the highly sterile hospital room exactly when she was highly agonizingly bleeding and highly tragically dying, completely from blinding fear. Exactly that is officially the absolute truth, exactly that you absolutely never, ever highly fiercely wanted, entirely to highly clearly hear. I am officially a highly pathetic coward who highly cowardly chose his absolute own highly toxic inheritance completely instead, entirely, of the beautiful woman exactly whom I fiercely loved, and the highly innocent child exactly whom she highly bravely carried, and you highly proudly rewarded me entirely for exactly that. I highly miraculously saved you completely from highly catastrophically committing the absolute biggest, highly catastrophic mistake entirely in your entire, massive life. No, you highly maliciously helped me entirely to highly catastrophically commit exactly it, and I highly, absolutely hate you entirely for exactly that, miraculously, almost exactly as incredibly much exactly as I highly absolutely hate completely myself. His highly arrogant father intensely looked directly at him. Exactly as directly at a highly complete stranger. You officially possess absolutely some highly pathetic kind entirely of highly severe nervous breakdown. You highly desperately need highly professional help. And I highly desperately need you entirely to confidently leave and absolutely never, ever safely return. We are completely 100% finished. After his highly powerful father confidently left, completely with exactly such a highly massive force, loudly slamming the heavy door, exactly that the large windows violently shook. Richard safely remained entirely in the highly dead silence. He highly deeply wondered. Is completely violently burning absolutely all the highly secure bridges, highly absolute liberation, or highly simply, absolutely just another highly pathetic form entirely of highly pathetic cowardice. Absolutely whatever exactly it officially was. It completely changed absolutely nothing. Catherine absolutely had not highly actively answered completely to his highly sincere letter. On the exactly 5th agonizing day, his expensive phone finally violently rang. The highly secure number was completely unknown. Richard highly rapidly answered completely before the exactly second highly quiet ring loudly sounded. Hello, highly dead. Silence. Then loudly sounded a highly severe female voice, incredibly hard and highly cold, exactly like freezing winter. Exactly, this is officially Sylvia Vance. The massive heart entirely of Richard, completely, violently, stopped. The highly devoted mother entirely of Catherine. The beautiful woman whose highly beautiful house had highly tragically cost his highly pathetic mistake. Sylvia, I'm absolutely do not actively speak. Highly simply, highly intently, listen! Her deep voice could highly easily cut highly expensive diamonds. My loving daughter highly successfully received your highly pathetic letter. She violently cried entirely for exactly 2 agonizing hours, completely after she highly meticulously read exactly it. Exactly 2 agonizing hours. Richard, do you highly profoundly understand exactly what exactly that highly explicitly means? You completely anew, highly maliciously hurt her, Absolutely, even your highly pathetic, miserable apology highly maliciously hurt her. I am incredibly, profoundly sorry. I absolutely did not, fiercely want. I explicitly said, keep completely silent. The highly commanding, strict tone completely, violently forced Richard entirely to highly instantly, completely shut his handsome mouth. I highly strictly explicitly told Catherine entirely to completely, violently, burn exactly that highly pathetic letter, and entirely to completely, forget entirely about your highly pathetic existence. I highly strictly explicitly told her exactly that you absolutely are not highly absolutely worth. Absolutely, even exactly 5 short seconds entirely of her highly precious time. Absolutely not highly actively speaking entirely about a highly peaceful meeting. I highly strictly explicitly told her exactly that you highly successfully possessed a highly fragile chance agonizing years completely ago. You confidently left. And exactly now you absolutely must highly agonizingly live completely, with exactly that highly pathetic choice completely forever. Do you profoundly know exactly what she highly softly replied? Richard literally barely highly miraculously managed entirely to highly softly whisper. What exactly did she highly softly reply? That she highly desperately needs entirely to vividly see you. Exactly one absolute last, highly specific time. Entirely. To highly honestly, explicitly, tell you exactly what she absolutely should have highly honestly, explicitly, told you absolutely all. Exactly these agonizing years. And exactly so. Completely against my highly absolute common sense, and absolutely all my highly protective instincts. I am highly actively calling entirely to highly honestly, explicitly tell you exactly where and exactly when. But highly intently listen completely to me, incredibly carefully, Richard Sterling. If you absolutely ever, completely again, highly maliciously hurt my loving daughter, if you highly carelessly pronounce absolutely even exactly one single heavy word, exactly that absolutely will highly actively make her violently cry. If you highly maliciously bring directly into her beautiful life, absolutely, even, exactly one highly microscopic drop entirely of highly severe suffering, I absolutely will highly aggressively make exactly it. The highly absolute meaning entirely of my entire massive life, entirely to completely, violently destroy absolutely everything. Exactly that you officially possess completely. Left, do you highly profoundly understand me? Yes. Saturday at exactly 10 a.m. Central Park, or Summer Garden, the highly quiet north entrance. Catherine absolutely will highly peacefully meet completely with you perfectly. There. Confidently come completely alone. Do absolutely not absolutely be completely late. And do absolutely not highly arrogantly expect completely from her. Absolutely anything. Completely else. Completely except entirely for exactly what you highly truly deserve. The highly secure connection completely, violently dropped. Richard confidently stood completely, utterly motionless, entirely for a highly incredibly long, massive time. The highly heavy words entirely of Sylvia highly loudly echoed completely in his highly empty, massive rooms. Catherine violently cried entirely for exactly 2 hours. His highly sincere letter, his highly desperate attempt. Entirely to highly magically express highly pure remorse had highly simply, highly maliciously caused highly brand new, massive damage. absolutely. Of course, exactly it highly tragically did. Absolutely everything, completely to her. To exactly which he highly carelessly touched completely, violently turned completely into highly cold ash. But she had highly graciously agreed entirely to highly peacefully meet completely with him. Why exactly? What exactly could she highly possibly fiercely want? Entirely to highly honestly, explicitly tell him exactly. Such exactly. That a highly sincere letter absolutely could not highly possibly highly successfully convey. Unless she highly desperately needed entirely to highly honestly, explicitly tell him completely. Straight, directly into his handsome face exactly. How incredibly. Highly much she highly absolutely hated him. Highly possibly. Exactly this was officially a highly fragile chance entirely for her. Entirely to highly aggressively vent agonizing years, entirely of highly well-deserved pure rage, entirely while he absolutely would confidently stand and highly patiently endure. He highly truly deserved exactly it. He highly truly deserved significantly worse. The highly bright morning entirely of highly anticipated Saturday confidentially arrived completely with highly excruciating, massive slowness. Over the highly exhausting past days, Richard had peacefully slept completely from highly absolute strength, exactly a highly few short agonizing hours. He flawlessly dressed entirely in highly simple, ordinary jeans and a highly ordinary cheap shirt. Absolutely nothing highly expensive or highly flashy. He confidently arrived directly to Central Park, exactly 30 agonizing minutes completely. Before the highly appointed precise time and highly patiently, waited perfectly by the highly quiet north entrance. The highly tight knot entirely in his heavy stomach, completely, violently, tightened so incredibly, highly tightly exactly, that it highly actively seemed, completely to him, exactly that he would highly violently vomit, right exactly. Now, at exactly precisely 10 a.m., he vividly saw exactly how she confidently walked completely down the highly beautiful alley. Catherine visually looked completely, utterly beautiful, and completely, utterly unreachable. Entirely in a highly simple, beautiful summer dress. Her beautiful hair was highly neatly gathered entirely into a highly practical, simple hairstyle. Absolutely no highly expensive jewelry, completely, except entirely for a highly simple watch. Absolutely no highly expensive engagement ring. She absolutely must have highly intentionally, deliberately left exactly it completely at home. Her beautiful face was incredibly calm, but her piercing eyes were incredibly hard, exactly like solid stone. Agonizing years entirely of highly massive pain were completely violently compressed entirely into exactly this single, highly piercing look. Richard, perfectly on, completely, violently, buckling weak legs, confidently stood completely up, completely, from the highly wooden bench perfectly on exactly which he had absolutely been peacefully sitting. Catherine, she completely stopped exactly 3 short meters completely, away, completely from him, highly strictly observing the highly safe distance, exactly, as if he were highly dangerously contagious. I am perfectly here, absolutely only, entirely, because I highly desperately need you, entirely, to highly intently, listen completely to highly certain specific things. Completely after exactly today, I absolutely never, ever highly fiercely want to vividly see you completely, ever again. Highly acceptable. I completely understand. She highly bravely took a massive, incredibly deep breath. Her soft hands were so incredibly, highly tightly, fiercely clenched perfectly by her fragile sides, exactly that her delicate knuckles went completely, violently white. When you highly ruthlessly abandoned me entirely in exactly that highly sterile hospital, I highly genuinely thought exactly that I would completely, violently die. Absolutely not completely, from the highly severe complications entirely of the beautiful pregnancy, but completely from the highly excruciating pain entirely of the highly absolute recognition exactly that the exact true man, exactly whom I fiercely loved, the exact true man completely, with exactly whom I highly genuinely thought entirely to highly miraculously build a beautiful life, highly arrogantly valued his absolute own highly pathetic comfort, significantly higher than my highly precious life. Do you highly profoundly understand exactly this? I was highly agonizingly bleeding. I was highly tragically dying completely from blinding fear. I highly pathetically begged you entirely to highly bravely stay completely with me. And you completely violently left, absolutely anyway. The dry throat entirely of Richard completely, violently, clenched. He fiercely nodded entirely because he absolutely could not actively speak. The highly respected doctor highly successfully stabilized me. I safely returned completely back, completely home, directly to my loving mama. The beautiful pregnancy highly stubbornly continued, completely in spite, entirely of absolutely everything. I highly agonizingly struggled entirely to highly successfully finish exactly that highly exhausting semester. Literally barely highly successfully functioning. Highly simply, highly desperately trying, entirely to highly successfully survive. Absolutely every single agonizing day, entirely in highly absolute order. Absolutely not, entirely to completely, violently, break completely down. Highly completely, 100%. Finally, her beautiful voice safely remained incredibly level, completely controlled. But Richard highly clearly heard the highly raging pure fury, violently storming completely beneath exactly it. Then the fragile belly completely, violently became highly noticeable. Highly nosy people highly aggressively asked entirely about the true father. I highly honestly, explicitly told them exactly that you had confidently left. The highly toxic judgment was completely immediate and incredibly cruel. Highly suddenly, I completely, violently became exactly that highly pathetic girl. The highly pathetic idiot who had highly carelessly got heavily pregnant and had absolutely been highly ruthlessly abandoned. The exact pathetic one who absolutely should have highly logically thought completely with her highly intelligent head. Catherine, I am so incredibly. I absolutely did not highly generously give you highly official permission entirely to actively speak. Her highly heavy words violently cut exactly like highly sharp razors. You absolutely will, absolutely only highly intently listen. Exactly this is absolutely everything, exactly that you absolutely will actively do, exactly today. Richard completely, violently shut his handsome mouth. The highly burning heat entirely of highly absolute shame completely, violently flooded his handsome face, flooded his, I highly agonizingly had, entirely to completely drop completely out, entirely of the highly elite university, entirely, because I absolutely could not highly possibly comfortably pay entirely for the highly demanding studies and a highly expensive nanny. I absolutely could not brutally work highly full-time, entirely due, completely, to the highly severe complications, entirely of the beautiful pregnancy. My highly devoted mother highly tragically sold her highly beautiful house entirely to highly expensively pay entirely for my highly massive medical bills. The highly beautiful house, exactly that, my highly devoted late father had highly miraculously built entirely for her, completely, before he highly tragically died. Exactly 32 agonizing years entirely of highly beautiful memories were highly tragically sold entirely, because I highly desperately needed highly urgent emergency surgery, and the highly cheap insurance absolutely did not highly successfully cover absolutely everything. Absolutely, every single heavy word was officially a highly brutal blow, entirely of a highly heavy hammer. Richard profoundly felt exactly how his weak knees were completely, violently buckling. But he highly aggressively forced completely himself, entirely to confidently stand, entirely to highly, bravely become a highly silent witness, completely to the highly massive destruction exactly that he had highly maliciously caused. I highly successfully found highly exhausting work. I highly exhaustedly cleaned highly dirty offices completely at pitch-black nights, actively being perfectly in my exactly 8th agonizing month, entirely of beautiful pregnancy. I highly exhaustedly washed highly dirty toilets, entirely. In highly massive corporate buildings, entirely. While you peacefully slept, entirely in your highly expensive, comfortable bed. My highly devoted mother highly successfully got a highly exhausting job, exactly as a highly dedicated in-home caregiver. Absolutely, even exactly. Though her highly crippling arthritis was so incredibly, highly severe, exactly, that she could literally, barely fiercely hold a highly simple glass. We highly bravely did exactly what we highly agonizingly had, entirely to actively do, entirely to highly successfully survive completely after exactly what you highly maliciously did completely to us. Down the handsome face entirely, of Richard absolutely. Reddy violently streamed hot tears. But he absolutely did not loudly emit absolutely any highly pathetic sound, and absolutely did not highly pathetically attempt entirely to highly aggressively wipe them completely away. Leo was highly magically born exactly 6 agonizing weeks significantly earlier than the highly official due term. Highly critical weight, exactly 3 pounds 15 ounces, or 1,800 grams. He highly flawlessly fit entirely in the fragile palms entirely of my loving mama. They absolutely did not completely know exactly if his highly tiny lungs would highly successfully work completely normally, exactly if he could highly successfully eat completely independently, exactly if he would highly tragically possess highly severe developmental delays entirely, due completely to the highly severe prematurity. I sat peacefully, perfectly, by his highly sterile incubator entirely for exactly 17 agonizing days. Highly agonizingly wondering, will my highly innocent son highly successfully survive? Highly agonizingly wondering, is absolutely God highly aggressively punishing me entirely for exactly the highly absolute fact exactly that I highly blindly trusted you? The fragile chest entirely of Richard physically felt completely, violently torn completely into a highly pathetic million pieces. But he highly aggressively forced completely himself, entirely, to highly intently listen completely further, to highly deeply absorb absolutely every single heavy word entirely of her highly justified, pure rage. But he highly successfully survived. And exactly that highly specific day, I highly bravely decided exactly that I would highly generously give him the absolute best beautiful life. Absolutely whatever exactly it highly tragically cost me. That he would absolutely never, ever profoundly feel completely himself, highly ruthlessly abandoned. That he would absolutely never, ever highly agonizingly wonder exactly if he was highly fiercely needed completely by absolutely anyone. That he would absolutely never, ever highly toxically doubt entirely in exactly the highly absolute fact, exactly that he is fiercely loved. Therefore, I brutally worked perfectly on exactly 3 highly exhausting jobs. I safely returned completely back directly to the highly elite university, completely on highly exhausting part-time studies. I highly bravely did absolutely everything, highly humanly possible, entirely, to highly, miraculously build, entirely for him, a highly stable, beautiful life. Entirely while you highly miraculously built your highly massive empire and highly pathetically pretended. Exactly that we absolutely did not highly actively exist. She violently paused, her fragile chest highly violently heaving completely from highly controlled heavy breathing. When she aggressively continued, her beautiful voice became significantly quieter. But absolutely not entirely even a highly microscopic bit, significantly less highly devastating. And exactly then, I beautifully met Paul. He was officially the highly dedicated nurse entirely of Leo, exactly when Leo became highly severely sick, completely with highly dangerous pneumonia and highly tragically. Had entirely to absolutely be highly urgently hospitalized completely anew. The highly massive medical bills entirely for exactly that miraculously, almost completely, violently annihilated us, highly financially. Paul highly astutely noticed exactly that I was peacefully sleeping perfectly on a highly uncomfortable chair perfectly next, completely to the highly sterile bed entirely of Leo. Highly astutely noticed exactly that I absolutely had not peacefully eaten entirely for agonizing days. Highly astutely noticed exactly that I was literally, barely highly successfully holding completely on, perfectly onto my weak feet. He highly generously brought me highly delicious food, completely from the highly busy cafeteria, highly intelligently explained. The highly complex actions entirely of absolutely every single highly potent medication, entirely in a highly simple language, exactly that I could highly easily understand. He was incredibly kind, completely to me, entirely, in exactly that highly terrifying time, exactly when I had completely forgotten exactly what highly pure kindness officially was. The strong hands entirely of Richard violently trembled. He highly rapidly shoved them completely into his deep pockets entirely to highly maliciously hide the highly pathetic tremor. We aggressively began entirely to highly happily communicate, then entirely to highly romantically date. He beautifully met Leo and absolutely did not frantically run completely away, completely from highly absolute responsibility. He highly proudly attended the highly competitive soccer matches and highly boring school plays, highly patiently helped completely with highly complex homework, was perfectly there exactly when Leo highly tragically possessed highly terrifying nightmares. He highly bravely earned the highly absolute right entirely to absolutely be highly proudly called Dad, completely by agonizing years entirely of highly constant, reliable presence. Do you highly profoundly understand? He highly bravely earned exactly it. I completely know, Richard whispered incredibly softly, completely, with a highly broken, deep voice. You absolutely do not completely know. You profoundly know highly dry, pathetic facts perfectly on highly cheap paper. Highly cold statistics completely from the highly expensive report entirely of a highly elite detective. You absolutely do not completely know exactly what. It highly explicitly feels exactly like entirely. To fiercely hold entirely in your fragile arms a highly agonizingly dying innocent son, and highly tragically possess absolutely no one completely with exactly whom entirely to highly peacefully share exactly that blinding fear. You absolutely do not completely know exactly what it highly explicitly feels exactly like entirely to brutally work exactly 16 agonizing hours entirely per massive day and absolutely, still highly, agonizingly. Guess exactly if you absolutely will highly successfully be completely capable, entirely to highly expensively pay the highly expensive rent. You absolutely do not completely know exactly what it highly explicitly feels exactly like, entirely to highly intently. Watch exactly how your highly devoted mother highly tragically sells her highly beautiful house entirely due, completely, to your highly catastrophic mistakes. You are completely 100% right. I absolutely do not completely know. I absolutely will never, ever completely know. And I highly absolutely hate completely myself entirely for exactly that. The beautiful expression entirely of Catherine absolutely did not beautifully soften. Exactly this. Absolutely. All explicitly means absolutely nothing, completely to me. I highly graciously agreed directly to exactly this highly anticipated meeting. Absolutely not entirely. Exactly that you would profoundly feel completely yourself. Significantly. Better entirely. Due completely to your highly toxic guilt. I highly graciously agreed entirely because I highly desperately needed you entirely to highly profoundly understand. My beautiful life confidently went completely forward. That I highly miraculously built absolutely something incredibly beautiful, completely from the highly cold ashes. Exactly that you highly ruthlessly left. That Leo is completely happy, completely healthy and fiercely loved. And exactly that. I am happily marrying a highly good, true man who absolutely, never, ever, absolutely, even entirely, for exactly one highly brief second, highly toxically. Gave me exactly a highly pathetic reason entirely, to highly toxically doubt entirely, in his highly absolute devotion. I highly profoundly understand exactly this. Highly truly. Because you highly proudly sent me exactly that, highly sincere letter. Exactly, as if it were officially a highly noble, grand gesture. Exactly, as if highly pathetic apologies can highly possibly, highly miraculously fix agonizing years entirely of highly massive damage. But they highly miraculously fix absolutely nothing, Richard. They absolutely only highly maliciously make you profoundly feel exactly that you highly bravely attempted, that you highly bravely did absolutely something highly meaningful. It is completely, utterly selfish. The highly brutal accusation violently struck perfectly in the highly absolute target, because it was completely, utterly true. The highly sincere letter was highly toxically dictated, completely by the highly pathetic need entirely of Richard. Entirely for highly absolute forgiveness. Absolutely, not completely, by exactly what was highly desperately needed. Catherine, you are completely 100% right, he stated literally, barely explicitly audibly. I am incredibly, profoundly sorry entirely for absolutely everything, for highly ruthlessly abandoning you entirely in exactly that highly sterile hospital, for exactly the highly absolute fact, exactly that I absolutely was not perfectly there exactly when I was highly desperately needed completely by you, for Leo, for the highly beautiful house entirely of your loving mother, for absolutely everything entirely, in exactly which I highly catastrophically failed you. I completely know exactly that my highly pathetic, I am incredibly sorry, explicitly means absolutely nothing. I completely know exactly that it absolutely will not highly miraculously change exactly what highly tragically happened. But I highly desperately need you entirely to explicitly know. Exactly now I highly profoundly understand exactly what I highly catastrophically did. I highly clearly vividly see exactly it, incredibly, crystal clearly. And I absolutely will highly agonizingly carry exactly this highly massive weight completely until my highly tragic death. Catherine intensely looked directly at him entirely for a highly incredibly long, massive time. Her piercing eyes highly intensely, searching perfectly on his handsome face entirely, for exactly that, exactly, which he highly, probably absolutely already absolutely did not highly successfully possess entirely to highly generously give. Finally, she aggressively began entirely to actively speak completely anew, and her beautiful voice completely, violently, became a highly tiny bit significantly as highly sharp. I absolutely do not highly completely forgive you. I highly fiercely want to absolutely be completely, 100% crystal clear. I absolutely will never, ever highly completely forgive exactly what you highly maliciously did, completely to us, completely to Leo. But I absolutely also absolutely no longer highly fiercely want entirely to highly agonizingly completely inside, completely myself, exactly this highly toxic hatred. It completely exhausts and highly toxically poisons me. Therefore, I highly bravely choose entirely to completely, violently let exactly it completely go. Absolutely, not entirely, for your absolute sake, entirely for completely myself. Because I highly, fiercely deserve highly absolute peace completely after absolutely everything, exactly that I highly bravely survived. You highly fiercely deserve highly absolute peace. You highly fiercely deserve absolutely everything. Absolute, best entirely in exactly this entire massive world. Then highly confidently, keep completely, infinitely or completely away, completely from us. Highly generously. Give me the highly absolute right, entirely to happily marry. Paul, highly generously. Give Leo the highly absolute right, entirely, to beautifully. Grow completely up. Entirely in the beautiful family. Exactly that we highly miraculously built completely, without your highly toxic interference. Absolutely do not completely, violently break our beautiful life. Absolutely, only entirely, because you highly suddenly profoundly felt completely yourself. Highly. Guilty highly, exactly upon. Vividly seeing us completely happy. Will you absolutely be highly successfully capable entirely of actively doing exactly that? Absolutely all the highly primal instincts entirely of Richard loudly screamed entirely to loudly scream, no! To highly aggressively demand a highly fragile chance entirely to absolutely be a highly beautiful part. Entirely of the beautiful life, entirely of Leo. To highly, pathetically beg entirely for absolutely anything. For absolutely any highly pathetic crumb exactly, that would highly miraculously connect him completely with the biological son, exactly whom he had highly ruthlessly abandoned, but the piercing eyes entirely of Catherine, highly strictly. Left absolutely zero, highly viable space, entirely, for highly pathetic negotiations. She was highly generously giving him a highly precious gift. The highly precious gift, entirely, of highly clear, strict boundaries. The highly precious gift, entirely, of highly precisely, explicitly, knowing exactly what, highly specifically she highly desperately needed completely from him. Yes, he highly clearly heard his absolute own, highly broken, deep voice. I absolutely will, highly confidently, keep completely, infinitely, far, completely, away. I absolutely will never, ever, highly actively contact you completely, ever, again. I absolutely will, highly generously permit you entirely to peacefully live your beautiful life completely without me. Absolutely. Something highly briefly flashed entirely in the beautiful expression entirely of Catherine. Absolutely not highly profound gratitude. Highly possibly. Highly simply. Highly profound. Relief completely. From exactly the highly absolute fact, exactly that he absolutely was not actively going entirely to highly aggressively. Fight completely with her. Thank you so incredibly much. She smoothly turned entirely to safely leave, then completely stopped, and highly smoothly threw perfectly on him exactly one absolute last, highly piercing look. I highly sincerely hope exactly that you highly successfully find exactly what you are highly actively searching entirely for, Richard. Highly, truly, genuinely, I highly sincerely hope. But you absolutely will not highly successfully find exactly it completely with us. perfectly between us. Absolutely everything is completely, permanently over. Then she confidently left. Her highly beautiful summer dress beautifully fluttering entirely in the highly fresh morning wind, ruthlessly leaving Richard completely alone, entirely in the massive park. Completely alone, completely with his highly terrifying ghosts, and completely all-consuming massive regret. He intensely watched, highly carefully, completely. After her completely, until she completely, violently, disappeared completely out entirely of highly clear vision. And exactly then, completely anew, heavily collapsed, completely onto the highly wooden bench, and highly desperately hid his handsome face entirely in his strong palms. She had absolutely been completely, 100% right, entirely. In absolutely everything. His highly sincere letter had absolutely been completely selfish. His highly toxic guilt, completely useless. His highly pathetic apologies completely miraculously changed absolutely nothing, but entirely to confidently leave right exactly now. To confidently leave completely forever. Highly, truly, genuinely, actively seemed exactly like highly tragic death. His expensive phone violently vibrated. Victor was highly anxiously calling. Richard highly weakly answered completely with violently trembling strong hands. Well, exactly how did it highly successfully go? Incredibly cautiously asked Victor. She highly strictly explicitly told me, entirely, to highly confidently, keep, completely, infinitely, far, completely, away. She highly strictly explicitly told me entirely to highly generously leave her completely alone. To highly generously give her the highly absolute right, entirely, to happily marry Paul. To highly generously leave them completely alone. Completely. 100% completely. And exactly what did you highly honestly explicitly reply completely to her? I explicitly said, yes. The highly heavy silence violently stretched. So you are highly, truly, genuinely, actively going entirely to highly simply. Exactly, like exactly, this. Confidently. Leave? And exactly what absolute other highly viable choice do I highly successfully possess? She highly fiercely deserves highly absolute happiness. Leo highly fiercely deserves exactly the highly absolute fact, entirely to beautifully grow completely up, completely without exactly the highly absolute fact. Exactly that my highly catastrophic catastrophe highly maliciously complicates his beautiful life. I absolutely owe them, absolutely, at least exactly this. Highly acceptable. Then safely return completely back directly to highly exhausting work. Miraculously build your beautiful life completely anew. Highly bravely attempt entirely to highly somehow miraculously actively move completely forward. But Richard absolutely did not safely return completely back directly to highly exhausting work. He confidently drove completely home, and entirely for agonizing hours, intensely stared directly at the highly blank walls, entirely of his highly massive luxury penthouse. Highly agonizingly. Wondering, how exactly absolutely must a massive man actively move completely forward? Exactly when he had literally just highly bravely agreed entirely to completely, violently amputate the absolute only highly precious part, entirely of completely himself. Exactly that had absolutely ever highly successfully possessed highly true, genuine meaning, Interactive question. Richard agreed to stay away forever. Do you think he can actually keep his promise, or will he find a way back into Leo's life? Tell us below. Part 5. The price of redemption. Exactly 6 agonizing weeks seamlessly passed entirely in a highly thick fog. Entirely of highly toxic self-destruction. Exactly that, Richard literally barely highly actively acknowledged exactly as his absolute own beautiful life. His highly arrogant father highly ruthlessly executed his highly toxic threats and highly aggressively sold the massive company. Highly toxically. Presenting the highly sudden departure entirely of Richard. Exactly as a highly premature, highly pathetic early retirement. Entirely due, completely to highly severe medical reasons. The absolute truth highly simply consisted entirely in exactly the highly absolute fact. Exactly that Richard had completely, violently, become completely unfit, entirely, for highly exhausting work. At exactly those highly rare, important meetings, exactly that, he highly pathetically attended. He confidently appeared completely unkempt and highly distracted. Loudly screamed completely at highly respected colleagues. Confidently walked completely out, entirely in the absolute middle, entirely of highly important presentations, exactly when highly severe anxiety, completely, violently, covered him completely with its highly terrifying head. Anastasia confidently went completely forward, completely with highly astounding massive speed. Her highly glamorous engagement completely to a highly elite partner, completely from her highly elite law firm, highly prominently, appeared entirely in the highly exclusive business chronicle exactly, less than exactly 1 agonizing month, completely later. Richard profoundly felt, absolutely, exactly, nothing highly meticulously. Reading entirely about exactly it. Absolutely. Only a highly vague, pathetic relief completely from exactly the highly absolute fact. Exactly that she had frantically fled completely from him. Completely. Before he had highly successfully managed entirely to completely, violently destroy her beautiful life completely too. She highly fiercely deserved absolutely someone who could highly possibly fiercely love her highly, truly, genuinely, absolutely, not highly, simply highly, pathetically play. Fake role. Victor highly anxiously called absolutely every single, highly few short agonizing days, but completely increasingly, less highly, frequently. Their highly brief conversations completely, violently, became completely increasingly shorter. Highly. Specifically, as Richard highly generously gave completely increasingly less highly viable reasons entirely for highly meaningful conversation, and entirely about exactly what was perfectly there, entirely, to actively speak. He was highly tragically drowning completely in highly plain sight, and absolutely everyone, highly clearly vividly, saw exactly it. But absolutely no one completely knew exactly how entirely to highly generously throw him a highly secure lifeline entirely, for exactly which he would highly, truly, genuinely, highly aggressively grab. Richard highly agonizingly spent agonizing days, highly aimlessly, frantically driving completely around the massive city, and highly inevitably, highly miraculously somehow, completely, violently ended, completely up, incredibly near the highly quiet street, entirely of Catherine in Queens. Exactly, although he had highly solemnly promised Catherine entirely, to highly confidently keep, completely, infinitely, far, completely, away. He absolutely never, ever, confidently stepped completely out entirely of the highly expensive car. Absolutely never, ever, confidently approached directly to her highly modest house. He highly, simply, safely parked entirely in a highly few short quiet blocks, completely away. Completely from exactly where. Exactly, it was highly perfectly visible, her small windows. And peacefully sat he perfectly there entirely for agonizing hours. Exactly like a highly pathetic, creepy stalker, highly frantically searching entirely for highly brief glimpses, entirely of a beautiful life, a highly beautiful part, entirely of exactly which he absolutely was not highly generously permitted, entirely to absolutely be. He highly clearly vividly saw the highly modest car, entirely of Paul, miraculously almost absolutely every single highly quiet evening. Vividly saw exactly how highly brightly lit completely. Up the highly warm light entirely. In the highly cozy room. Exactly that, absolutely, must have perfectly been the highly adorable nursery entirely of Leo. Vividly saw highly dark shadows, highly smoothly, gliding completely behind the highly drawn curtains. A highly complete, beautiful family, highly peacefully. Living their highly normal, comfortable routine entirely. While Richard safely remained completely alone, entirely in the pitch-black darkness, highly meticulously cataloging his highly massive failures on exactly one, entirely of the highly gloomy Wednesdays. Exactly 6 agonizing weeks completely after the highly explosive meeting entirely in the massive park. Richard highly shockingly discovered completely himself safely. Parked perfectly, perfectly. Outside the highly busy elementary school entirely of Leo. He absolutely did not completely remember exactly how he had highly bravely decided entirely to confidently go perfectly there. Absolutely did not completely remember exactly how he had highly frantically searched entirely for the highly specific address. He highly, simply, highly, shockingly found completely himself, peacefully, sitting entirely in the highly expensive car, perfectly on the absolute, other, highly distant side, entirely of the highly busy street. Exactly when the highly boring lessons completely ended. At exactly 3 p.m., highly intently watching. Exactly how the highly energetic children violently poured completely out, directly onto the highly busy street, directly to their highly impatiently waiting, loving parents. And exactly then he vividly saw Leo, his biological son, highly proudly, carried a highly cool Batman backpack, exactly, that was miraculously, almost completely, 100%, his absolute own, highly massive size. His highly innocent face was incredibly serious, entirely, while he highly cautiously descended completely down the highly steep school steps. The highly polite teacher explicitly said absolutely something completely to him, from exactly which Leo beautifully smiled. A highly bright, incredibly beautiful, pure smile. Exactly, precisely exactly, like absolutely that. Entirely of Catherine. The fragile chest entirely of Richard, highly agonizingly clenched, completely under the highly massive weight, entirely of absolutely everything, exactly that he had completely, violently lost, and absolutely will highly agonizingly lose completely, permanently, forever. Then confidentially appeared Paul. He highly easily, smoothly moved completely through the highly dense crowd, entirely of highly loving parents, flawlessly wearing absolutely still his highly sterile medical uniform. Highly probably he had confidentially arrived completely straight, completely from highly exhausting work, entirely to highly happily. Pick completely up his innocent son. Leo vividly saw him, and his absolute entire, highly innocent face, completely miraculously transformed completely from highly pure, unadulterated joy. The innocent boy violently ran, the highly cool backpack highly wildly bouncing completely behind his fragile back, and violently threw completely himself completely onto Paul, who completely without absolutely any highly pathetic effort, highly flawlessly caught him, and highly smoothly scooped him completely up directly into his strong arms, completely with the highly practiced, perfect movement, entirely of a massive man who had highly lovingly done exactly this, exactly thousands, entirely of agonizing times. How exactly highly successfully passed your highly beautiful day, my highly absolute champion? Paul highly happily asked, highly comfortably, seating him perfectly on his strong hip. Boris completely anew, highly maliciously took my highly beautiful pencil. But exactly this highly specific time, I absolutely did not violently hit him. I highly intelligently used heavy words, exactly as you highly patiently taught me. Exactly. That is officially my highly absolute boy. I am incredibly proud, entirely of exactly the highly absolute fact, exactly that you highly bravely make highly correct, brilliant decisions. They confidently walked directly to the highly busy parking lot. Leo highly relentlessly chattered entirely about his highly exciting day, and Paul highly intently listened completely with highly absolute, pure attention. Highly intelligently asked highly complex questions. Highly successfully made. Leo loudly laughed completely with highly fun jokes. Exactly that Richard absolutely could not highly clearly hear. Richard highly intently watched exactly how they safely got completely into the highly modest sedan. Vividly saw exactly how Paul highly lovingly, carefully buckled Leo highly securely, entirely in the highly safe car seat, completely with the highly ruthless efficiency entirely of absolutely someone who had highly lovingly done exactly a highly massive 1,000 agonizing times. Vividly saw exactly how they safely drove completely away, directly toward highly safe home. Highly delicious dinner, highly complex homework, and absolutely all. Exactly those highly normal, incredibly beautiful, highly precious moments, entirely of highly pure family life. Absolutely something entirely in Richard completely, violently broke. Absolutely some highly absolute, last highly fragile thread, entirely of highly pure hope or highly pathetic illusion, completely, violently, snapped, ruthlessly leaving him highly agonizingly gasping entirely for heavy air, entirely in the highly expensive car. Highly fiercely, clutching the highly expensive steering wheel completely until his delicate knuckles went completely, violently white. He absolutely was not a highly beautiful part entirely of exactly this. He absolutely will never, ever completely be. Leo highly successfully possessed a true father who highly proudly appeared absolutely every single massive day, who profoundly knew his highly favorite polite teachers, his highly complex problems completely with Boris, and exactly how incredibly tightly it is highly strictly necessary, entirely to highly securely tighten the highly strong belts perfectly on the highly safe car seat. And Richard was officially a highly pathetic nobody, a highly biological, pathetic accident, a highly pathetic source entirely of highly basic genetic material, and completely, utterly, absolutely nothing significantly more. With violently trembling, strong hands, he confidently drove directly to the highly cheap liquor store and highly expensively bought a highly expensive bottle entirely of vintage whiskey. Safely returned, completely back directly to the highly massive luxury penthouse, and aggressively began entirely to highly heavily drink, completely with the highly methodical, absolute purposefulness, entirely of a massive man, highly desperately actively attempting entirely to completely drown. Exactly what highly stubbornly refuses entirely to completely die. Absolutely, however, incredibly deeply you highly desperately hide exactly it. His expensive phone violently rang completely, utterly relentlessly. Victor. His highly arrogant mother highly frantically calling entirely to highly maliciously scold him entirely for the highly massive shame entirely of the highly elite family. The highly strict lawyer highly aggressively demanding highly official signatures, perfectly on the highly complex documents, entirely for the highly massive sale entirely of the highly elite firm. He completely ignored absolutely everyone, and highly heavily drank completely until the massive room completely, violently spun. And his highly brilliant thoughts completely clouded exactly highly sufficiently enough entirely to highly generously give him absolutely at least a highly microscopic drop, entirely of highly pathetic relief, completely from the highly constant massive pain, somewhere entirely in the highly blurry region, entirely of the exactly eighth highly expensive glass. Richard highly smoothly pulled completely out his expensive phone and intensely looked directly at the highly secure contact entirely of Catherine. The highly secure number exactly that he had highly safely saved, agonizing years completely ago. Exactly when they had absolutely been completely happy and highly passionately planned a highly bright future. The highly secure number exactly that he had absolutely never, ever completely deleted entirely in spite. Entirely of exactly the highly absolute fact, exactly that he had completely blocked her exactly then. His strong finger highly dangerously hovered perfectly over the highly green call button. Absolutely do not highly actively do exactly this, highly strictly warned his highly rapidly fading, sober, brilliant mind. You highly solemnly promised, you highly honestly explicitly told her exactly that you would highly confidently keep completely, infinitely, far, completely away. But the highly drunken, pathetic part entirely of his highly shattered consciousness, completely, violently broken, and completely desperate, absolutely already gave absolutely zero pathetic damn entirely about highly solemn promises, about highly strict boundaries, about highly absolute respect, or entirely about exactly what was completely 100% right. He highly simply, highly desperately needed entirely to clearly hear her beautiful voice. He highly desperately needed absolutely, at least absolutely some highly pathetic connection, completely with the absolute, only highly genuine thing exactly that had absolutely, ever, highly truly mattered. He highly desperately called. The expensive phone loudly rang exactly 3 agonizing times. Then, highly smoothly answered a highly deep male voice. "Hello? Paul." Absolutely. Of course, exactly, it was officially Paul. Exactly. This was officially his beautiful life, exactly now. His beautiful family. The deep voice entirely of Richard actively sounded incredibly slurred and completely pathetic. "I highly desperately need entirely to actively talk completely with Catherine." Who exactly is exactly this? Richard Sterling. "I highly desperately need entirely to actively talk completely with her." Highly dead. Silence. Then the deep voice entirely of Paul, completely, violently, became incredibly cold and highly hard. "She highly strictly asked you entirely to highly confidently keep completely, infinitely, far, completely, away." I completely know, but I highly simply highly desperately need, I highly desperately need entirely to highly honestly, explicitly tell her exactly that I am completely anew incredibly sorry. I highly desperately need her entirely to explicitly know exactly that you highly desperately need entirely to completely stop highly actively calling. The deep voice entirely of Paul was incredibly firm, but absolutely not highly cruel, highly professional, exactly as if he were highly efficiently dealing completely with a highly difficult, complex patient. "You are highly maliciously upsetting her." She violently cried completely after the highly explosive meeting entirely in the massive park. She is finally completely happy and highly stable. Absolutely do not completely violently destroy exactly this. Absolutely only entirely because you profoundly feel completely yourself, highly ashamed. I vividly saw Leo exactly today, perfectly near the highly busy school. He is so incredibly, highly similar completely to her. The highly heavy silence exactly that seamlessly followed was incredibly dangerous and highly sharp exactly, like a highly lethal razor. "You absolutely were perfectly near his highly busy school." The deep voice entirely of Paul, completely, violently changed. Exactly now the highly clinical calm was completely, flawlessly replaced completely by a highly fierce, pure instinct entirely of highly absolute protection. "You highly maliciously stalked the highly busy school entirely of my innocent son? He is officially my biological son completely too." No. The highly simple word loudly sounded exactly like a highly lethal gunshot. "You highly simply highly carelessly donated highly basic genetic material." Exactly that absolutely does not highly miraculously make you a true father. A true father is officially the exact true man who highly proudly appears absolutely every single massive day, who highly lovingly changes highly dirty diapers at exactly 3 a.m., who confidently goes directly to the highly elite doctors and highly happily reads the highly exact same specific fairy tale exactly 50 agonizing times, completely in a row, entirely. Because his innocent son completely, utterly adores exactly it. Who fiercely loves completely, unconditionally, completely without highly pathetic hesitations and highly massive regrets. You absolutely are not exactly this, and you absolutely will never, ever completely be. Absolutely. Every single heavy word was a highly brutal physical blow, because they absolutely were completely, utterly, devastatingly true. If I absolutely ever vividly see you completely again perfectly near the highly busy school entirely of Leo, I absolutely will highly urgently call the highly elite police. If you absolutely ever highly actively contact Catherine completely again, I absolutely will highly successfully obtain a highly strict restraining order. Highly generously leave my beautiful family completely alone. They have absolutely already highly tragically suffered highly sufficiently enough, entirely due completely to you. The highly secure connection completely, violently dropped. Richard safely remained peacefully, sitting entirely in the highly dark, massive penthouse, highly fiercely clutching the expensive phone entirely, while the highly heavy words entirely of Paul highly loudly echoed completely through the highly empty, massive rooms. My beautiful family. Absolutely not the beautiful family entirely of Richard. The beautiful family entirely of Paul. Because Paul had highly bravely earned exactly this highly exclusive right, completely by agonizing years entirely of highly constant, reliable presence. Entirely, while Richard had frantically fled. The highly expensive bottle entirely of vintage whiskey safely stood exactly, half completely empty, perfectly on the highly polished coffee table. Richard completely anew, confidently reached directly for exactly it. But exactly halfway, completely, violently, stopped. Highly heavy drinking absolutely would not, highly miraculously fix exactly this. Absolutely nothing would highly miraculously fix exactly this. He had completely, violently destroyed his beautiful life. And exactly now, he would highly agonizingly have entirely to peacefully live perfectly among the highly pathetic ruins, exactly that he completely himself had highly maliciously created. The expensive phone violently vibrated. A highly secure message, completely from a highly unknown, secure number. He highly nervously opened exactly it completely, with violently shaking strong hands. The bright screen incredibly slightly floated completely from the highly cheap alcohol. It is officially Catherine. Paul highly honestly, explicitly, told me exactly that you highly drunkenly called and highly carelessly mentioned. Exactly that you absolutely were perfectly near the highly busy school entirely of Leo. I am highly politely asking you entirely for the absolute last, highly specific time. Please, highly generously leave us completely alone. I completely know exactly that it is incredibly painful entirely for you. I completely know exactly that you highly agonizingly regret. But your massive pain absolutely does not highly legally give you the highly absolute right entirely to completely, violently violate our highly absolute peace. Leo is completely happy. I am completely happy. Paul is incredibly, highly kind, completely. To absolutely both entirely of us. If I absolutely ever explicitly meant absolutely anything completely. To you. If our biological son absolutely ever explicitly meant absolutely anything completely to you. You absolutely will, highly respectfully, respect our highly strict boundaries, and highly bravely continue peacefully, living your absolute own beautiful life. Own. Below the highly strict message was officially a highly beautiful photograph. Catherine, Paul, and Leo, perfectly on the highly beautiful shore, entirely of the highly sparkling Hudson River, or Gulf of Finland. Leo is highly happily building a highly intricate, massive sandcastle. Paul is perfectly on his strong knees, perfectly right, perfectly next, completely to him. Highly happily helping entirely to highly carefully dig highly deep moats. Catherine loudly laughs completely at absolutely something, exactly that. Exactly one, entirely of them. Highly jokingly said. Highly happily throwing her beautiful head completely back, entirely in highly genuine, pure joy. A highly perfect, flawless moment entirely of highly pure family happiness and highly absolute completeness. Richard intensely stared directly at exactly this highly beautiful photo entirely for a highly incredibly long, massive time. Highly meticulously memorizing absolutely every single highly beautiful detail. The highly beautiful smile entirely of his biological son. The highly pure joy entirely of Catherine. The highly gentle, reliable presence entirely of Paul. Entirely in their beautiful lives. They absolutely were completely, utterly complete. Completely without him. He was completely, utterly unnecessary, completely to them. Highly objectively, they absolutely were significantly better completely without him and his highly toxic complications. With highly disobedient, numb fingers, he highly rapidly typed exactly one single, highly brief reply message. You are completely 100% right. I am incredibly, profoundly sorry. I absolutely will never, ever highly actively contact you completely, ever again. I highly solemnly promise. Then he completely, violently blocked her highly secure number completely before he could highly possibly, highly tragically, regret entirely about exactly it. Entirely and absolutely another highly pathetic minute, entirely of highly toxic weakness, completely blocked the highly secure number entirely of Paul, completely deleted the highly clear photographs, exactly that he had highly safely saved completely from the highly expensive report entirely of the highly elite detective agonizing months completely ago. He completely, violently erased absolutely every single highly digital trace entirely of their highly beautiful existence, entirely, in his expensive phone. Exactly as if exactly this could highly, possibly, highly, miraculously help him entirely to completely forget. He absolutely would not completely forget. He profoundly knew exactly this completely, with highly absolute, pure certainty. But exactly this was absolutely everything, exactly that he highly successfully possessed completely, left entirely to highly generously give them. His highly complete, absolute absence. Interactive question. Richard just blocked Katya and promised to stay away forever. Do you think he will actually keep his word this time? Tell us below. Part 6. The price of absolution. The absolute next highly bright morning. Highly agonizingly fighting completely with the absolute worst, highly severe hangover entirely, in his entire massive life. Richard highly urgently called his highly elite lawyer and highly bravely did exactly what he absolutely should have highly bravely done, agonizing years completely ago. He highly officially created a highly irrevocable, massive trust fund entirely for Leo. Massive money, exactly that. Would highly expensively pay entirely for the highly elite university. Highly massive medical expenses. Absolutely everything. Exactly that the young boy would highly desperately need entirely during his entire beautiful life. But completely, 100% anonymously, Leo would absolutely never, ever explicitly know exactly that. Exactly, it was completely from Richard. He would absolutely never, ever profoundly feel completely himself, highly toxically obligated, or highly heavily burdened, completely by exactly it. He would highly successfully possess highly massive resources exactly when he highly desperately needed exactly them. It was completely, utterly inadequate. It would absolutely never, ever highly miraculously compensate entirely for absolutely everything. But it was absolutely something, completely concrete, exactly that he could highly possibly actively do, completely, without completely, violently disrupting their beautiful lives. Then, Richard highly efficiently packed exactly one highly simple suitcase and confidently left the massive city, completely without highly honestly explicitly telling absolutely anyone exactly where. He highly simply confidently drove completely until the highly luxurious buildings entirely of massive Manhattan, completely, flawlessly replaced completely by the highly severe, dark forests entirely of highly distant upstate New York or Karelia. He highly secretly rented a highly secluded, quiet cabin, perfectly on the highly beautiful shore, entirely of a highly remote, quiet lake. And safely, SAT perfectly. There, entirely in highly crushing, dead silence. Highly desperately actively attempting entirely to profoundly understand exactly how entirely to peacefully live completely with completely himself. Victor absolutely. Still highly successfully found him exactly 3 agonizing weeks significantly later. Confidently appearing entirely in the highly secluded cabin, completely with highly delicious groceries, and completely with highly severe anxiety, highly deeply carved, completely into his handsome face. You absolutely cannot highly simply completely violently disappear, Victor stated, highly aggressively unloading the highly delicious food perfectly onto the highly dusty kitchen countertop. Your highly arrogant mother is highly aggressively threatening, entirely to highly urgently report directly to the highly elite police. Highly toxically thinks exactly that you highly catastrophically did absolutely something completely irreparable. I am completely perfectly fine. You absolutely are not completely perfectly fine. You are peacefully sitting completely alone, entirely in the highly dark forest, and highly maliciously punishing completely yourself. Highly possibly I highly fiercely deserve highly severe punishment. Victor completely stopped highly aggressively unloading the highly delicious groceries and intensely looked completely straight directly into his piercing eyes. Exactly what you highly catastrophically did was completely, utterly terrible. Highly, probably completely unforgivable, but completely, violently destroying completely. Yourself, right, exactly. Now. Absolutely. Will not highly miraculously help absolutely anyone. Absolutely not Catherine. Absolutely not Leo. Absolutely not absolutely, even completely yourself. And exactly what am I highly officially supposed entirely to actively do? Highly honestly, explicitly. Tell me exactly how entirely to violently wake completely up. absolutely every single bright morning profoundly. Knowing exactly that my biological son highly happily calls Dad. Absolutely another massive man. And exactly that. Exactly. This is completely, 100% right. That entirely for him exactly. It is significantly better, absolutely not entirely, to explicitly know me. You highly peacefully accept exactly it. You highly peacefully accept exactly the highly absolute fact, exactly that you absolutely cannot highly possibly miraculously fix, exactly it. That highly certain, specific mistakes are completely irreversible. And exactly then, you highly successfully find a highly viable way entirely to peacefully live completely forward. To miraculously become significantly better than you absolutely were. To highly aggressively ensure exactly that you absolutely will never, ever, completely again, highly maliciously, cause absolutely anyone exactly such highly massive pain. Richard intensely looked directly at his highly loyal friend. At exactly this highly good, true man, who safely remained perfectly on his highly flawed side, entirely in spite, entirely of absolutely everything. I honestly do not completely know exactly how. Absolutely no one completely knows entirely at the absolute very beginning. But you absolutely still highly bravely learn entirely. Because the highly pathetic alternative is officially entirely to completely, violently, give completely up, completely, 100% entirely, and entirely in spite, entirely of absolutely thing. I absolutely do not highly genuinely think exactly that you are completely ready, entirely for exactly that. They confidently stood entirely in highly heavy silence, entirely for a highly incredibly long, massive time. The absolute only highly quiet sound was officially the highly loud noise entirely of the highly cold wind, entirely, in the highly dark pines, perfectly outside the small window. Then Victor incredibly quietly added, "Your highly powerful father highly successfully sold the massive company, is highly actively relocating completely abroad, highly toxically. Says exactly that he absolutely never, ever highly fiercely wants entirely to highly possibly have absolutely any highly pathetic business completely with you, completely ever again." Your highly arrogant mother confidently took his highly toxic side. Richard profoundly felt absolutely, exactly nothing, perfectly at exactly this highly explosive news. His highly arrogant parents had absolutely always highly toxically valued, highly pristine reputation, significantly higher than highly genuine relationships. Absolutely. Of course, they completely, violently disowned him entirely to highly successfully save their highly elite status. Highly generously let them confidently leave, Richard stated. They absolutely were never, ever highly, truly, genuinely, perfectly there, absolutely anyway. And exactly what absolutely will you highly actively do? Richard highly agonizingly remembered the highly beautiful smile, entirely of Leo, perfectly near the highly busy school. The highly pure laugh entirely of Catherine, perfectly on exactly that highly beautiful photograph, completely from the highly beautiful bay. The highly patient, pure devotion, entirely of Paul. Completely to the innocent boy who absolutely was not highly biologically related completely to him, but was officially his biological son entirely, in absolutely all The highly profound senses exactly that highly truly mattered. I honestly do not completely know completely yet, but I absolutely cannot highly pathetically continue entirely in the highly exact same pathetic spirit. I absolutely cannot highly pathetically continue highly maliciously torturing completely myself, highly intently, watching their beautiful lives completely from highly distant afar. I highly desperately need entirely to highly somehow miraculously actively move completely forward, highly, truly, genuinely, then safely return completely back directly to the massive city, Victor highly smoothly suggested. I officially possess a highly reliable contact entirely in exactly one highly respected nonprofit organization. They highly actively work completely with highly desperate homeless families. They highly desperately need a massive man who would highly bravely head the highly complex program entirely for highly successfully writing highly lucrative grants. It absolutely is not highly glamorous. The highly pathetic salary is completely, utterly ridiculous. But it is officially highly meaningful, pure work, highly miraculously helping highly vulnerable people who highly truly, genuinely, desperately need exactly it. Richard highly deeply pondered, brutally working entirely to highly miraculously help completely other beautiful families. Exactly, although his absolute own, he had completely, violently destroyed completely, directly to the highly cold ground. Entirely and exactly. This perfectly. There was absolutely some highly strange, profound rightness, highly absolute redemption, highly brilliantly disguised, exactly as highly exhausting work. Highly acceptable, he stated. I highly bravely agree. Exactly, too. Agonizing weeks seamlessly passed completely before Richard profoundly felt completely himself, highly sufficiently ready entirely to safely return directly to massive Manhattan or St. Petersburg. He highly successfully found a highly modest, cheap apartment entirely in a highly quiet neighborhood exactly where he had absolutely never, ever peacefully lived completely before. In a highly quiet place exactly where perfectly there absolutely were no highly painful memories. He aggressively began highly exhausting work entirely in the highly respected NGO, and violently threw completely himself, completely into exactly. It completely, with an absolute intensity, miraculously, almost bordering completely on highly desperate mania. Highly successfully, managing highly complex programs entirely for highly desperate homeless youth. Brutally working exactly 14 agonizing hours, entirely per massive day, highly passionately. Writing highly lucrative grants and highly efficiently. Organizing highly massive resources. He brutally worked completely until he completely, violently, collapsed completely from highly massive exhaustion, completely incapable, entirely of highly deeply thinking, entirely about absolutely anything, completely else, completely, except entirely for highly deep sleep. It highly miraculously helped him, a highly tiny microscopic bit. Exactly that he highly successfully possessed a highly pure purpose, absolutely not highly toxically connected, completely with his absolute own massive pain. Highly miraculously helping highly innocent, strange children. Exactly since he absolutely could never, ever, highly miraculously help his absolute own. And he highly solemnly kept his highly sacred promise. He absolutely did not confidently drive completely past the highly modest house entirely of Catherine. He absolutely did not highly frantically search entirely for them, entirely on the highly public internet. He absolutely did not, completely, violently, break his highly sacred word, completely, anew. The highly anonymous, massive trust fund, highly flawlessly continued. Entirely to absolutely be highly generously replenished, absolutely every single agonizing month. But exactly that was officially his absolute, only highly fragile connection. Exactly this absolutely should have absolutely been completely enough. Exactly this absolutely should have highly miraculously brought absolutely, at least absolutely, some highly pathetic peace. But absolutely. Every single highly dark night, Richard peacefully lay completely without. Highly deep sleep entirely in his highly empty, quiet apartment, and highly agonizingly wondered. Is exactly this highly absolutely everything? Is exactly this exactly how his absolute entire, highly remaining beautiful life absolutely will visually look? Highly exhausting work, entirely for the absolute sake, entirely of highly complete strangers, entirely, while his absolute own biological son beautifully grows completely up, highly happily, calling Dad absolutely another massive man, and he successfully possessed absolutely no highly viable, other complex answer, completely, except entirely for the highly exact same specific one, exactly as, completely from the absolute very beginning. Yes, exactly. This is completely, 100%, precisely exactly, what he highly truly deserved. Interactive question. Richard is trying to redeem himself by helping homeless families and staying away from Leo. Do you think he has finally learned his lesson? Tell us below.